Oh, there's Abby. Great. Okay, good morning. It's 9:05 on November 12th. This is the meeting of the Vermont Climate Council Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee. We are going to meet for about 3 hours this morning. The majority of our meeting is going to focus on our various pathways of strategies and actions, with the goal of trying to finalize those, given some ongoing conversations about outstanding issues and feedback we received from the full Climate Council last week. Then we have a few cross-cutting issues related to land use, education, and some other topics to try to cover. We'll shoot for breaking for public comment around 11:30, 11:35. Then we'll wrap up with kind of next steps and what we need to do to get things completely done on time for the council to finalize the plan for December 1st. So with that, do folks approve that agenda as posted along with the minutes from last week, or any questions on either of those?
I have a question.
Yes.
Is there a reason why you've gone back to one public comment?
I don't think so. I know that Pat graciously put the agenda together for us this week. We could certainly do another round of public comment at the end of the meeting.
Well, it just seems to be a bad host to have them wait 3 hours and then most of the people are gone, so they don't hear the public comments.
Sure. Well, we've got one time at 11:30, 11:35 schedule. We can try to do one earlier in the morning as well. So I've got no problem with that. So
okay, thank you. And I also have a question. My question about is a forest? Can we discuss that in one of these pathways, or should it be a separate line item? The one I had last week.
Sure. Allie, Dr. Kosiba is back with us today, and she can hopefully speak to that with some authority. So yeah, I would just ask Pat to think about the best place to try to fit that conversation in.
Thank you.
I'm just taking a note here. Good.
Abby, you good with all that? All right. Okay, with those additions to the agenda, everyone good with the agenda and minutes from last week? Okay, thumbs up. Great. Well, before we dig into the work, this is on the agenda, but even without that prompt, I think, Abby and I want to just again thank you all for the tremendous amount of work you've done for the past 6 months, or I guess year almost now, and especially in the past few weeks when we've really dug into finalizing our matrix and working through some of the more challenging detailed issues, and done it in a very professional, respectful way, and I think generating some excellent work for the council. So I want to thank you all personally for that. And we're not quite done, but we're sure close, at least for this round. All right. Oh, look at that.
Ready to dive in?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I wanted to say a few words as we get started, and Simi wants to chime in broadly, and then we'll dive right into our kind of our heavy agenda. And Judy, I'll put a break for another public comment around 10:30, maybe around or after biomass. I think I just want to commend all of you for the hard work you've all done, and I think also that this group has really tried to take seriously the just transitions and the equity issues. And sometimes that has been painful, sometimes it has been difficult, and it is also incredibly important. And I really commend you all for doing that. So you'll see there's a little block in there that says past and future. And there's a reason I'm doing that, so bear with me a minute and we'll get started. And that often in mediation, we always say, we got to get people to look forward. We have to get people to look forward. Let's put the past aside and look forward. And over the years, as I've done work, particularly with Indigenous people, First Nations and tribes in the US, that doesn't really work because the past is ever living present really for all of us, and particularly for people who've been marginalized, whether it's Indigenous people or people of color. And so there's a great quote by Faulkner I'm going to put in the chat. And what he wrote, he was a great Southern writer with his own racist issues, but also wrote really complexly about the South. And he wrote, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." So one of the things I kind of ask all of us to do is keep present in this meeting today. That's why there's the box, that there's actually a space for the past that's living here that we need to keep in mind. And I also put future in there too, because you all are doing really important work, and the future is kind of depending on you doing this work for a whole number of reasons because of the threat of climate change. And so I hope we can kind of keep and hold both the past and the future in mind as we do our work, and being respectful that both those things are in some ways present with us. And just want to acknowledge that as we begin. So I wanted to state that before we begin to dive into more of the tactics. Okay. All right. So what I've done is I've gone through all the comments we had within our group last time, and then all the comments, as far as I know, that we received one way or the other from the Climate Council. And we're going to kind of just march through them as best we can. And our goal is to try to get through all of these. Let me just talk about what I think in co-chair's way. And it's like, after today, the goal would be any final changes that we're making, we'll go back to kind of the pathway authors to kind of incorporate final changes into the documents over the next few days. I think, Jane, if I can't remember right, I think we can post this by next Tuesday or Wednesday, if I remember right. And we'll be clear about that by the end of the day. The other thing that we have to do is we have to have a kind of response to comments chart. So whatever comments the VCC provided, we need to kind of have a response, whether noted, incorporated, we didn't do this, here's why. And so also I will get those things loaded up, and as long as we don't exceed a quorum, we'll put those on probably a Google Doc for people to fill out just on their section so it can be full, and we'll make that available publicly, and it will be also being transparent about how we responded to their comments. But we can talk about that at the end too. So I just want to be kind of clear about where we go from here. Next Friday, we will return to our kind of draft final that we posted for the Climate Council, and we'll really test for final consensus on the language that people worked on between the end of today and next week. So next Friday will really be a key decision-making meeting to kind of finalize and the like the work that we've been doing. Any questions about that, Jane? Anything clarifications you want to add to that? Co-chairs, anything else on that? Okay, so pathway A, we're just going to march down. One of the things we talked about, David and Ryan, last week was that there may be some things in actually pathway F land use that actually belong better in sequestration and storage. So we'd move them up to pathway A. So David, Mears, I don't know if you have a recommendation, or Ryan, you have a recommendation about which specific ones we would do that on, just so we can be really explicit about what we're trying to do. David?
I have not had a chance to give that any thought, so I don't have a detailed recommendation.
Ryan, how about yourself?
I'm going to need a refresher of which sections folks thought would best be elevated. I recall at the time it didn't not make sense, but haven't vetted that recommendation anymore since
I think
the
it
last
was
meeting.
Was it that I'm now remembering? I think I was supposed to look at it too and totally didn't. That seems so sorry. I think maybe it was that some of the agroforestry or the woody vegetation pieces maybe, but I could be completely manufacturing that. I don't know for sure.
Anybody else have a memory of this? It may be at this point, if it's not that important to folks, maybe we leave it as is because we're kind of out of time. But any kind of quick thoughts on that? This was our own comments, so if it's good enough as is, we can leave it and move on, unless people feel strongly we need to shift things around.
I think we necessarily run into challenges when we split actions which have impacts on many different facets of mitigation, adaptation, resilience. It makes it tricky to say which one does it fit best in. That's just my own personal struggle with keeping them in different places. But in reviewing the language that was put forth, nothing is really jumping out at me. It's like, yeah, no, this is, and again, the pathway F compared to section 14, sequestration and storage, or the other one, like I'm kind of having a trouble keeping where they've actually ended up in the document. But I don't have a an objection to keeping it where it is as it stands.
Okay, great. Well, unless someone wants to advocate, let's move to the next one. Okay, so the next one was also on pathway A, and the Vermont Climate Council had some comments and they had questions. There were two actions under, I think, strategy 5 and 7 under pathway A around the renewable standard and planting trees. And they either, I don't know that they disagree, they didn't understand. So I don't know if someone wants to kind of explain how the planting tree piece would feed into the rec or not. But I think that was one issue they raised we need to address in some fashion.
Well, I can just clarify. I think there was concern that that activity isn't currently kind of authorized or consistent with the way that the renewable energy standard works. So the recommendation would need to be to revise that law to make this activity kind of eligible under tier 3, or, you know, there need to be more direction to the council around this one, was what I heard from Liz Miller, who I think raised this issue.
Any thoughts?
That tracks with my memory of it as well, that it was just, they needed clarification as to what specifically we were recommending be shifted in the RES, I believe.
Any concerns about being a little maybe more explicit about the intent to revise that law to incorporate tree planting in some fashion? Questions, thoughts? And I'm trying to think who was the pathway A, Ryan, that's you, right? So maybe we can work on incorporating some language to be a little bit more explicit about that.
It's going to be Charlie or Billy.
Okay.
Like trees and energy, not agriculture.
Billy, is that something you'd be willing to work on to kind of refine that action a bit more?
Sure. Well, I guess it would be helpful to understand what the intent of the group is the action to amend the state's renewable energy standard to enable support for this activity is basically what we're talking about. Okay. If that's the case, yeah, I'm happy to work on that. I just don't want to do it if that's not the intent of the group.
Okay. Okay, good. All right. Okay. Next, pathway B. So we're going to move on to pathway B. So this is the language around land use planning and the climate office action. So we've had lots of discussion. And I think that Alyssa and or David agreed to try to work on some language regarding that. So I want to kind of turn to those. I think we had 2 recommendations on that. So Alyssa and David, over to you about your thoughts about how we proceed.
Sure, thanks, Pat. And thanks, folks that contributed to the conversation in advance. We do have some suggested language for revising this based on the, we came to consensus our last meeting around some changes, and then I tried to kind of draft something that would include the other comments. And I think we're pretty close. So what I'd like to do is just share my screen with where we're at. And then I think there are 2 outstanding pieces. There's some questions about what the state planning office means and whether or not we should be recommending that. And the other is around what it means to either resource independent municipalities to follow through with policy or how we encourage them. And so while I'm sharing, let me make sure I'm sharing the right draft. I wonder if David could maybe comment, or others that were involved with this.
Well, I'll just say thanks to Alyssa. I also didn't really work on this over the time since last week. Alyssa really did carry the ball on it. And I think she's, from the conversation we had by email, it sounds like most of us are in agreement. I think there's probably some tinkering with the language that's worth considering. But that's my only comment.
Right, so Alyssa, thanks for putting that up. So why don't people take a look at this?
Great. And I encourage anyone else who was part of that conversation to share. I think Judy had a question about whether or not the state's central planning office is under one agency. And I know that Billy has some background knowledge.
Questions, comments after looking at this? And
Well, there was on the, it said revitalize the, reviving the state central office plan. And I didn't want it to be a contradiction. Like if we revive it and it was under one office, I didn't want it to contradict that we were saying it was going to be across agencies.
Oh, that's, yeah.
So I wanted clarification on what it meant to revive the state central planning office. And I think David clarified that.
Yeah, I mean, the planning office used to be in the governor's office. And so, and for what it's worth, I thought I would just share a little anecdote so people understand my perspective on why having a statewide office is valuable. That's with no disrespect to the Agency of Natural Resources team that Billy leads. But the anecdote I'll share is that following Tropical Storm Irene, state agencies were all running around doing our very best with staffs all trying to do their jobs to respond to the crisis. And in the midst of that, there were really some important decisions that had to be made. And one concrete example of that was decisions about whether we rebuild roads in the same place, whether we put culverts back at the same size that they were, whether we get into rivers and streams and dig them out. And so we could put roads back exactly the way they were. And you can imagine that the Agency of Transportation and the Agency of Natural Resources staff had different perspectives on that. And in the normal course of events within state government, if an engineer, a staff person at one agency disagrees with a staff person at another agency, there's a race to see who can get to their boss first. And then a question of whether those two bosses have time and capacity to argue with each other. And then whether they want to take that and lift that up to the governor to make a call on it. And it's highly inefficient and uncertain and ad hoc. And what we did is the governor at that time put in place a series of statewide coordinators that worked directly for the governor. And so when that person was proactively running that reaction, it cut short all of that process and bureaucracy that we didn't have time for. And the agencies had a responsibility to work things out much more effectively. So that's part of why I feel like it's worth considering a state planning office that's headquartered in the governor's office.
And I agree with you, David. And that's why I'm asking, does reviving the state central planning office, is it the right words to have in there? Is it a contradiction to the suggestion of having a representative from every state agency, if indeed the old one was under one agency?
Yeah, the old one was under the governor's office. So it's
The old one was, okay.
Yeah, so I don't think it's a
Okay.
contradiction.
Okay, thank you.
Judy, you're okay with revive, given that?
Yeah.
Path?
Yeah.
All right, any other, Lauren, sorry, I didn't see your hand. Over to you.
Well, that was a helpful exchange between Judy and David for me. So thank you both. I think the only something that Judy said at the end there about the interagency representation that I think could happen under a governor's office, central planning office, is that I still think this language kind of conflates the two separate ideas. A central planning office responsible for development and implementation of a statewide land use plan is still a little bit different, I think, from what was discussed in task. Gosh, I think the central planning office was discussed in task 5D, nature-based solutions, and I think the interagency office of climate was discussed in 5E. I'm in both of those groups, so I might be conflating it myself, but my general understanding was the interagency office of climate was an opportunity to have agency representatives who are responsible for different permitting, regulatory, funding programs to come to the table and understand where there are opportunities to support one another, where there are redundancies that can be made more efficient, where programs don't necessarily appropriately address climate change and where they might be bolstered. So I think that still is a little bit different than a planning office responsible for a statewide land use plan. So I think my only concern is the recommendation that we do one or the other. But maybe if a state central planning office that is kind of envisioned as David just explained it could do both things. I just want to make that note.
Any thoughts about whether these need to be two separate recommendations or one singular one as written?
I really just want to appreciate Lauren's comment and say that during our meeting last week, we merged the two. So separating them would, I'm okay with that. I wonder if anyone feels opposed to, I think we could easily just pull out existing phrases and sentences from this into two of them.
So Alyssa, when you're talking about 18 agencies, departments, and commissions, is one of those a climate change agency?
Well, I think the California Air Quality Resources Board is part of that, but I would have to look at the list of all the agencies and commissions that are part of that again. I'm sure I could bring that up.
Because if it wouldn't that solve Lauren's issue?
Of merging them versus having separate?
No, if the 18, if one of the 18 agencies to sit at the table was the Climate Council as it exists today, wouldn't that solve the problem of them being merged or not, or being two issues and not one?
I guess I was hearing Lauren say that maybe there were two potentially different roles or goals of how David described the state planning office versus just the interagency coordination. I don't feel strongly, but I wonder if Lauren or David or anyone else wants to respond to that.
I'm trying to think, what do people think? Because one is, yeah, go ahead. Maybe someone's trying to speak. Yeah, one is like around land use planning in particular, right? In which you provide greater coherence or clarity or connection, whatever the right words are, even though the planning may involve natural lands and, traditional kind of municipal land use stuff. The other one, I think, maybe to what Lauren just said, is very specific to coordinating climate activity across all the agencies. And I don't know whether that should all just be one entity that sits under the executive branch or some form of that, or whether these are two distinct things, though they're related. I don't know, what do people think?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is they are two distinct things. Also, just going off of what I understand California's model to be, so California does have a governor's office of planning and research, which is one of the agencies that participates in their climate action team to coordinate the interagency work. So it seems as if, that those functions are distinct and have, there's distinct purposes behind them.
Let's give Alyssa, who's editing in real time, bless her. So let's give her a minute to do this.
I think you guys should keep talking. I was just going to come up with maybe some quick suggestions for what they would look like separately, and
perfect,
and hope that would advance our conversation. But I don't want to hold up the process by editing.
Jane, there's one. Why don't we do that? Jane, note one thing. I just saw something in chat from you. Do you want to describe what's in the cross-cutting?
Sure. So as part of the cross-cutting pathways section that's being lifted up to the council on Tuesday for their review and discussion, there are two buckets. There's the cross-cutting pathways, of which some of your work flows into, such as education, compact settlement, that are really quite fleshed out and ready. They have pathway strategies and actions. And then the second part of that work speaks to cross-cutting themes, which identify key enabling buckets of work that need to happen in order to advance the climate action plan as a whole, but need more work by the council and others in the coming months after December 1st. And one of those themes is clearly around capacity and organization, and the document speaks specifically to a climate office as one of those themes, and thinking about how to organize government around moving forward the climate action plan and other climate action more broadly. So I just wanted to highlight that that's in there and speaking to more work after December 1st. It also speaks to workforce development and other things such as those kinds of big issues.
All right, Billy.
So just a couple points. The California materials that were shared clearly says that there's one agency that's leading the implementation of their comparable Global Warming Solutions Act. So it's not true. You know, there's a climate team discussed that I guess advises that group, but it clearly says in those materials that that AB 32 directs the California Air Resources Board to be the lead agency to implement the law. So that's the model that California uses, as far as I can tell from those materials. Second, notwithstanding David's excellent example of the response after Tropical Storm Irene, and elevating decisions that needed to be made in real time to the governor's office, I would just caution you all, the closer you get to any governor's office and the further you get away from agencies that are staffed by career scientists and experts, the more politicized decisions become. When you're having an agency full of career scientists, policymakers, and professionals make decisions, those are done typically consistently with a long view and not as mercurial as those made by people closer to the top executives. So I would just caution you all that you really need to think about where these decisions are being made, who you want at the table, if you want it done well.
Judy.
Thanks, Billy, for your opinion, but I would caution the other way. The closer you get to the agencies, the more you're apt to have an agency theme or an agency direction opposed to a public direction that people have input into.
So here's one thought. I think this group, one will struggle to come up with I think just the back and forth that Judy and Billy just had about, because I think people have differing views, just as both well articulated. And also, it sounds like in the cross-cutting around this, it's open to further conversation. So I don't know whether on the Interagency Office of Climate, it's better just to say, create a coordinating mechanism. It needs further discussion, elaboration. There's a range of views on where it should sit, and maybe just leave it at that for now, rather than try to parse it too much here, where it's going to get taken up anyway by the bigger group and even beyond, this year. So wonder if we can come up one level and say, yes, coordination or interagency office is important. Exactly how it's organized, differing views needs to be worked.
I think that might be too vague though, Pat. A coordinating mechanism might just, if that's what gets end up getting put in the climate action plan, that might just mean you will make sure that state agencies meet once or twice a year to talk about what they're working on, and not necessarily a formal structure. And I think there's probably I'm hearing less concern or differing opinions around simply standing up an Interagency Office of Climate to coordinate different programs and activities and ensure efficiency and shared outcomes than there is around the state planning office, central state planning office. So I think I would recommend keeping the language of an Interagency Office of Climate.
And Laura, you just kind of keep what Alyssa has up. Would you just, Lauren, suggest kind of leave that as it is on C, what's now C?
Let me read it quickly.
Yeah, no problem. Take your time. Take your time.
And I'm happy to put these in the chat if folks can't read them. I'm not sure what the Zoom level is for you.
Zoom's pretty good from the.
Yeah, that looks great. Thanks, Alyssa.
Okay, so it sounds like there's little opposition to this. And how do we feel about this one?
About the state land use one. Charlie.
A clarifying question. If something's housed in the executive branch, does that mean it's in the agency of administration, or am I not understanding that correct?
I mean, the executive branch is anything that's under the governor. Could be in the governor's office, or it could be an agency.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure, that a single agency wasn't conflicting with the executive branch, because I just don't know like how, if everything in the executive branch is considered agency of administration, or if I'm just totally misinterpreting that agency wrong, which I probably am. So that was it.
And I don't, so right, so David, this could sit under the governor's office directly under the governor. It wouldn't sit under administration, wouldn't sit under A&R. It would sit by itself potentially, right?
It could. I mean, this language doesn't decide that. It could be under the Secretary of Administration, or it could report directly to the governor, or and the governor can delegate the governor's authority to secretaries and commissioners.
This is
I think
probably not.
Charlie's point is that if it is in the agency of administration, then it would conflict with the line that says a single agency should not house or control this.
Right. That's right. Good point. For what it's worth, 2 other New England states have solved this problem differently. I'm not sure we want to get into state reorg here, but under Mass and Connecticut, they essentially created an Uber Office of Energy and Environment, which pretty much folds all of the activities under a single Uber agency. There's advantages and problems with that both, but that's how Connecticut and Mass have kind of dealt with this issue over time.
Well, I had a question just for Billy, because I completely agree with his assessment, of the risk of having, decisions made close to an elected official. I'm wondering though, Billy, like in my mind, I'm distinguishing between, say, a permit decision or a specific decision about, a particular land use decision from setting broader goals that cut across agencies, multiple agencies. And what I'm suggesting is that having someone at the level of the governor's office telling the this public service department and A&R and transportation and ACCD and ag, resolving disputes around what's the right balance of how much land should be managed this way versus that way. It's just as a matter of governance, it's more effective to have that set of decisions made there, because otherwise there's no one to make that decision. There's no clear process for doing it. It's kind of left as a scramble between the agencies to, which secretary has the best relationship with the governor, or who can get the legislature to support their perspective. So it's not that coordination wouldn't happen. I'm just as a matter of efficiency, I've been thinking that having some of those higher level planning decisions made at the level of the governor's office would be more effective, and that the risk of politicization at that level is more about balance, and maybe that's where it should be at that level. Like if we're saying we want a greater emphasis on protecting forests, and that's politically unpopular, that's a factor that should be going into the state's decisions.
No, that's a good point, David, and I appreciate you framing it that way. I just generally struggle to kind of understand what this entity would be doing. I think, sure, there's a handful of policy decisions that elevate that where there's disagreement kind of across agencies that elevate to the governor's office. I think each governor has their own way to kind of manage those issues. This would potentially create a framework for those decisions, but I think so much of agency's authority is fairly well set in statute and rule that there's not a ton of these things that do bubble up. I could be wrong with that. You would know better than I, given your past experience in state government. But I'm coming at this from this perspective. The state has limited resources financially, staff-wise. We're facing a climate crisis where we're going to need all available resources. We have existing agencies within state government that effectively communicate and do their work to forward their missions and statutory authorized programs. And just creating a superstructure on top of that that's nebulous, that isn't tied to any particular plan or legal authorization. I just don't see the kind of cost benefit of that, given everything else that needs to happen for us to achieve our climate goals. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm not saying the idea of increased coordination is a bad idea. I think that's great. I just, who's going to work here? There's going to obviously have to be people. If this is going to be an office, where are those people going to come from? Who's going to pay for those people? All those things. I just don't see what the cost benefit is for us to make such a concrete recommendation at this time. So that's where I'm coming from.
Thanks, Bill. Let me take the hands that are up, and then I kind of want to see if we can focus on language just because of moving this forward. So I've got David, if you have more to say, then Judy, then Ryan, then Abby.
No, I very much appreciate Billy's point, and I think we could probably, given enough time, figure this out. I'll just share one more anecdote. When I worked in Washington State, the governor's office had designated staff in an office of kind of overall planning that were had specific expertise in areas. It wasn't a huge office, but it was the difference in Washington State from Vermont, from my experience of state government, was night and day. In that, when there's a dispute, if I was having a fight with the Agency of Agriculture when I was at ANR, I would go have to work it out with them. And then if we didn't come to agreement, we had to make an assessment of, is it worth pestering the governor about this? It's like when you want to, like you're fighting with a sibling, like, do I really want to take this to mom and dad, or are they going to punish both of us? It doesn't really incentivize like a process for lifting up disputes and debates on really important issues. And in Washington State, everybody went straight to their person and said there was a person who had expertise and capacity to hear and listen and resolve those. And that person had the direct ear of the governor. That's the kind of, that sounds more like dispute resolution, I suppose, than planning. But it's the same principle when I think about planning, that when agencies have plans that conflict in terms of emphasis and focus, that having somebody who's got the time and resources at a higher level than the age secretary level to make those recommendations, there's a value to that. But I cannot disagree that in Vermont, this has been a tripartisan there's tripartisan opposition to the creation of a state planning office because of the very reasons that Billy has suggested. And I feel like it's come out of Vermont's tradition of looking at government with an eye of scarcity, that we can't really afford more people and more managers and more discussion because we roll up our sleeves and we get stuff done, which works until and unless we have conflict.
Thanks, David. Judy.
Yeah, and that conflict component, David, is what I'm concerned about. If you have a conflict and you go to an agency as a member of the public, they listen to you and that's it. They do, like Billy said, have statutes and policies that they have to follow. And so that's what they do. They follow the statutes and policies regardless of what the public says. If it's in the role of the executive board, we have a voice. We put those people in there. We can take them out if they don't listen to us.
Yeah, see, that's where I have a challenge here. If folks don't like the laws, then they need to change the laws. It's not a matter of executive decision making. But I'm gonna kind of stop talking and let you. I think I've articulated where I stand on this, so I'm gonna just stop, and you guys can all continue work.
And I want to just note that this conversation is a perennial American conversation about how government should be structured. And so, and it's an ongoing conversation across states, at the nation. And so I'm not sure it's resolvable ultimately in policy and legislature, but this is almost like a Madisonian debate we could keep having, but I'm not sure quite how we solve it here. Ryan, Abby, and Lauren.
I'll keep it brief then, because I definitely don't have a way to solve it. I just wanted to speak with the general agreement with what Billy's framed for the pragmatic implementation of law, and the way in which at least from my experience within the Agency of Agriculture, legislative directive and appropriations guide action quite significantly, and this recommendation is likely going to need to go through a legislative process to create the directive and the funding to do this. And so focusing on that space for conversation is, I think, an important part to acknowledge. and then to step back and ask, what role does the Vermont Climate Council potentially play in this as far as providing direction, guidance, and advice to the legislative body, and what we think would be most effective for, I know this climate action plan and timing is a big issue, but as this is amended within at least 4 years, and a number of councilors have terms of, I believe, at least 2, there's space to continue to have these conversations and, understand how implementation is happening. And so I think that the creation of the Climate Council and the subcommittees could be an important planning and discussion space for these topics. Thanks.
Great. Abby.
Yeah, I have no solutions either. I just want to, I feel like my role here. I want to just name what I think is going on, which is that, this is a really tricky conversation because we have people at this table who are members of government agencies, who understand the nuances of that work and what that means and how that's determined really, really well. And then we have a number of us who are on the outside of that and who have experienced in various ways sort of the challenges as practitioners or the public in trying to navigate the nuances of individual agencies and or have seen what happens when they collide with one another and power dynamics aren't addressed, and the power structure doesn't necessarily work out as some of us in the public or whatever might hope that it would. And so I think, honestly, some of this is, at least from my part, is just a continuing fear of climate is so critical and it's so interconnected, and the way that our government functions currently is not in an interconnected way, at least not from my personal experience. And I think that's what some of this is that climate change is an issue of such magnitude that it has to require collaboration. And I think what we've seen here is when it's not done with an equitable lens, we just leave the same people behind. And I think a lot of us here are really, really concerned with that, again, given our personal experiences and what we've seen. So I don't know how we solve that with this language or not, but I think that that's where some of this is coming from. It's like, I personally am just terrified at the notion of climate change existing in any one branch, because I understand the implementation needs. I take Billy's point about, the appropriate stewardship of public dollars and public investment, right? And taxpayers' money. That's very real. I just think that that's some of what's being named right now is this. There are those of us at this table that have or know people who have struggled to be heard in the government structure as it currently exists, or have our livelihoods taken seriously and things like that. And that's very real. And in the face of climate change, we need to be doing everything that we can to not have that happen. So I think that's some of what's going on here.
Thanks, Abby. There's a great quote says is where you stand depends on where you sit. So I think we're having a little bit of that going on. Lauren, then Jake.
Good quote, Pat. Look at you with quotes today.
Sorry.
I'm not sure that I can offer any silver bullet solution here, but I take Billy's point well about not only making sure that subject matter experts, scientists, housing experts, transportation engineers, et cetera, they already exist within state government and they're doing good work where they sit. But the need for those experts to be more closely aligned or have an opportunity to work more closely together on a shared vision for what the future of Vermont looks like. And so I just want to put a plug in for, regardless of the structure that we recommend to the full council or whatever the full council might keep or not, for the actual statewide land use plan itself, I see as like a critical component of the climate action plan, of the climate council process of Vermont for the next 10 to 30 years. You know, we have 80% of our land base is privately owned. We have an aging demographic, which means we're in the midst of a huge generational land transfer. We know that we're losing ag land, prime ag soils out of production. We know that we're anticipating a pretty significant renewable energy build out, energy infrastructure for that to reduce our emissions. We know that we're in the midst of an affordable housing crisis. We also know that we're experiencing shifting climate impacts that will likely only worsen over the next 10 to 50 years, which means where we put our infrastructure, where we put our people, where we make sure that we leave space for habitat connectivity so those species can migrate with the changing climate is incredibly important. And if we don't do something thoughtful about what that vision looks like to meet all of the different components that climate and its impacts will have, I just think we're setting ourselves up for significant failure, and something that doesn't necessarily capture what I think I've heard from this group, which is pretty much a shared vision that you know, if you protect nature, nature will protect us. And so I just want to make sure that we're not losing sight of that piece of this. So I don't really care about the structure, I guess is what I'm saying, but I will die on the hill of making sure that there's a statewide land use plan, I think.
Jake.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, just looking a little more closely at H306, one of the charges of that proposed legislation, so I guess it's still, you know, it's not a guarantee, but if it were to pass, one of the charges is to look at whether or not a state planning office should be housed within the executive branch, what the duties of this office should be, how it'll be funded, and how to ensure equity. So there's elements to that would be explored through that legislation that I think is both acknowledging that there's still unknown factors to what a state planning office should be, what it should look like. And I'm concerned in our certainty of language around, say, something like this would be embedded in the executive branch. Like if H306 is to pass and a committee forms and they do all this research and look at the issue and they say, you know, actually we're recommending that it doesn't, you know, it puts we're making sort of a preemptive recommendation that might not necessarily be the most effective arrangement for this type of office. So I think we should be careful about the level of certainty of those types of recommendations within the recommendation, because I think there's still a lot of questions about, yeah, what the most effective arrangement sort of body that this would be housed within. And so yeah, that's all. I think we're close to having this in a place that feels like we're acknowledging that there's more that needs to be vetted about how this could be an effective approach to state planning, and that there's legislation currently that's looking to explore these issues in more depth and detail than what we have to discuss today, you know, in 3 hours or whatever time we have allotted for this conversation right now. So I just feel like there's so many unknowns with this, but it seems as if there's a general consensus of like the need to look into this further and in support of what H306 is kind of proposing at this point to do.
Well, let me give Alyssa a minute here Alyssa, I think you've got a sense here you're thinking of, so let me have you kind of think about that and why you do that. Judy, go ahead.
I would not strike a single agency or any of that. I would strike the H36 and let them come up with their own place where they want to discuss it.
I mean, I guess my response to that, Judy, is I don't feel fully informed about what the best way in which to implement this idea, and that H306 is would be providing us and other Vermonters and the legislature and the governor with better information about how this could work in practice. And I don't feel like we have the time to get into the mechanics and nuts and bolts of this in a detailed manner to feel so certain that we can put a recommendation forth that isn't acknowledging H306 and the need for that legislation, that we need an entity to actually be providing us with more depth so that it can inform the strength of our recommendations about the need for a state central planning office, and that not to discredit the experiences that are held here, but clearly it feels like this is a statewide conversation at this point, and we're trying to sort of take that on amongst the 12 of us, and that just feels a little overwhelming right now, to be honest.
I don't think we're trying to take it on. I think we're trying to give an opinion, a recommendation. And my recommendation would be that we have the central planning office and a single agency should not house it. And that's a recommendation. If you want to leave H306 in there, fine. But I think it should be our recommendation to those working on H306 that a single agency should not house this land use plan.
So let me. So I think here we're not going to resolve reasonable and fair viewpoints about, again, the kind of the role of the political versus the agency, quote unquote. I do think there's some interest people have stated, and maybe Alyssa, we can capture these in here. That one is, I think, in a strong interest about ensuring how this is constructed addresses equity and citizen access is, I think, one. I think there's interest two about efficient use of limited state resources. And three, I think, to David's point about effective conflict resolution. And I think those are at least three important interests that whatever this is designed needs to meaningfully address.
Can you just repeat those last two, please?
Sure. Equity and citizen access, efficient use of limited state resources, and effective state.
What was that last part?
And effective conflict resolution.
And just citizen should go in front of access, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. It's equity and citizen access.
Sorry, Alyssa, you're still typing.
No, it's okay. No, it's okay. I just was trying to get it down and then I can wordsmith it. But I'm happy for folks to suggest things in real time. It's great getting it done.
I am not in consensus for striking a single agency should not house this.
So here's where I think, Judy, to that point, because when we can't reach consensus, we recognize difference. And so I think what we need to then add here is that the subcommittees have two views. One is a single agency should not house it. Another view is a single agency should, I don't know what the counter is, a single agency should lead or something like that, to Billy's point. And we recognize both views. Because I think that's probably where we're at. John.
Okay, so you're saying to not strike it and then add that there's a difference in opinion.
You got it, exactly.
Okay.
I smile because I think we're getting back to what we did like 2 weeks ago, where we said we would put the disagreements in the recommendation, and then that was deemed a terrible idea.
But I think, I did check in with Jane and a few folks. I think generally where we can't reach consensus, we try to as cleanly and shortly as possible recognize difference where we can. And that way we're still able to forward things to the full Climate Council and be transparent. Jane, your box open, so it's going to go to you.
Yeah. Two things, I guess, on this. One, I'm struggling. Marion and I were going back and forth a little bit behind the scenes here, talking about this recommendation, where I feel like the statewide land use plan recommendation that Lauren articulated and all of you have been articulating feels clearly to sit within your recommendations. But we were going back and forth because the way the language is written about a climate office and coordinating of climate action work in the cross-cutting themes. That is an issue that's been raised in multiple subcommittees, but the cross-sector in particular punted to the cross-cutting pathways group. And so Marion and I were suggesting whatever language you all came up with here on the climate office specifically, we could pull into the cross-cutting pathways because it felt more relative there if you were going to split these two issues of state planning versus climate action coordination. But now I'm just sort of struggling with maybe the language that we already have in the cross-cutting pathways around a coordination of climate office and climate work is enough based on where you're getting to here. So I would encourage folks to look at that the way it's written for the council meeting next week, and if we need to go farther there. And then second, I just wanted to speak briefly to the dissenting opinions. That is something we're going to talk about with the steering committee this afternoon, and some erroneous other kind of issues of how to deal and what to put in the December 1st plan, and what we'll get to after December 1st and how we'll deal with dissenting opinions.
Jane, a question. In the language that you have suggested for the other section, is it short enough you can just put it in chat?
Yeah, let me cut it out and I'll do that.
That'd be super helpful. So I want to just try something here. So Alyssa, could we take the single agency language and put it at the bottom, and then yep. And then I would like to say Billy or someone who advocates more for, you know, a kind of an agency lead can maybe give us a sentence to put the different view. And then at least for now, we recognize both. But I don't know, Billy or somebody who would advocate that view, how would we describe the other approach, just in a sentence? Oh, Judy, you're on mute if you're trying to say something.
You're not recognizing both if you have a strike through that sentence.
No, we're getting rid of the strike through. Exactly. We're getting rid of the strike through. Sorry about that.
Yeah, it's not final. I'm just trying to. Okay.
We could say something like views include, you know, one, what the sentence there, and then two, whatever the other sentence is. And then I'll come to the climate office in a second, separately from the land use one. So Billy or someone, can you articulate in a sentence kind of the differing view of how things should be structured?
I don't really have a recommendation here. This isn't something that I think is a priority action for us. So, you know, I don't really have thoughts. I think we've discussed that we want coordination around climate. I've suggested that happen through a division within A&R that coordinates with other state agencies. I know that's not an idea some folks like, so I don't, you know, I've said my piece here. I just don't see this as a topic that we need to spend an hour on at this point in our process. But I'm going to defer to you all here. I'm not going to stand in the way in the work that you're going to produce.
Well, let's give it a crack here. I think what the idea, a general idea is alternative coordination could be with a, you know, essentially led by a single agency with connection to others or something like that.
Yeah, I guess my point is that these are like fairly significant detailed discussions around the kind of governance model of the state, significant policies. And I just don't know that this group, with no testimony from anyone outside of our group, is in any kind of position to kind of make these decisions.
But I think I think the group feels strongly enough to keep talking about it. So I'm just recognizing the energy in the room to try to get to a closure here, to your point.
Yeah, sure, go for it. I'm just sharing why I'm not able to be more helpful right now.
Oh, Alyssa.
No, I think Billy, your comments are really helpful, and kind of seeing the other way this could work is that, you know, some part of A&R could be the coordinating agency. And I want to remind folks, at least how I think about this, is like, we're not making the decision, we're making a recommendation. There are other recommendations that will be made, and this will be taken up as an idea that potentially has some merit and is likely to be modified in its implementation. And so I think just capturing the thoughts and the good ideas and good intent here with that in mind is useful. even if there is some dissent, it seems like it's important enough to make note of rather than take out. And so I don't feel strongly about whether or not this is a super short recommendation or one that fully fleshes out both sides of the conversation, but I think like at least having some note that these ideas came up is important.
I wonder if what we've got is sufficient enough for now, and I want to go to C to talk about kind of where we're at with that, and then we'll go to other topics. Again, I know people have a range of views of how important this is to include and how to include it, and I think this is probably about the best we can do right now. Okay. I'm gonna, if it's okay, then move to C. As Alyssa just finishes up some detailed writing, Alyssa, thank you so much for that. On C, I wasn't sure, Jane, were you able to put the language in the chat about C? The Interagency Office of Climate.
Marion and I are going back and forth right now, just trying to reconcile where the language is or didn't make it in. So give us a minute.
Okay. All right, let's do that. Why we do that, I wanted to turn, Alyssa and Lauren, was there anything else in B that you felt we needed to go through today? I just want to check if, in addition to the Interagency Office of Climate, we'll return to it. Is there anything else in B that you all wanted to raise with the group?
I think there's some very low conflict pieces. And so let's do that, because that'll feel really different for a minute.
Let's do that. Nice.
Great. Okay, so I think one of them is that we had 3 different end that were very interconnected and some of them had very few or no actions, and so they were merged into one. And so now we have the promotion of healthy connected river corridors, floodplains, and wetlands, inclusive of all of the language you created, and that's been compiled in specific actions. And I've retained all of kind of the introductory language for this strategy that compiles the 3 of them, but I sent this in an email to Allie and Lauren and Billy this morning and didn't get any challenges back, so I think it's likely okay. But that is a change, just in the structure really of how things are. So in those kind of, I know that there were some outline documents that just listed strategies and actions without the narrative pieces, that will likely need to be updated to reflect this change.
And we do have a task of reconciling the matrix with all this work before we're done here for sure. So any questions or comments on kind of, these is really not eliminating anything, it's combining for kind of clarity. As Alyssa said, any questions about that? Okay.
Great. And then there may have been one other small thing. I think it's this one, which Allie sent, I'm not sure I put it in here, but Allie sent some revised language for this. It was confusing, and Lauren mentioned that maybe Bob Pop had written it, and so if he's here, could be helpful to just hear from him the intent here. I will copy in the new language. That's the only other change, aside from, I've accepted all kind of like the minor changes that you saw in the track changes version from last week.
Any questions on that?
Can you go back up to the paragraph, the complete paragraph before that?
This?
Yeah.
Sure.
Whoop, where did?
Oh.
Thank you.
Just zoom out so you can see it all.
Yeah, I'm not liking that last sentence at all.
This one?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do you have a suggested revision?
Yep, delete it.
Okay. I think those others that have helped write this, I think this may have been suggested by Allie. Wonder if folks want to weigh in before I take it out.
So phenology, variability, and increased ground disturbances altering Vermont's biodiversity. If you were not talking about a plant and you were talking about people, would you have that same sentence?
I guess a question for folks is how important is that to be in there? Again, we did have a long discussion, I think came to an accommodation around the actions here. But I think on this one, how important is that to state in this text? If it's not that important to folks, we can strike it. If it's important, then we need to have a discussion. So does anybody want to advocate to leave that phenological variability statement in, and then we can have further conversation if people do. If people don't, then we can strike it.
Because it's not proven. I mean, we know those plants will find balance. We know things will balance out. It's just that we are concerned about time and we don't want to give it time to balance out.
So I just want to check to see if anybody wants to advocate for that. Great. If not, I think we can strike it.
I don't know that I need to advocate for it, but I think if you drop off the which needs to be restored, which is kind of the call to action piece that maybe there's concern over with Judy, and Judy, I'd love your take, but the first big chunk of that is factually accurate, that we are losing biodiversity in the state, both with our flora and fauna species, and that is creating a significant imbalance in the environment here. And I think that is something, a trend that is going to continue to worsen, especially as we continue to see changes in our seasons. And so I think maybe a nod to that, acknowledging that biodiversity loss, which is critical for survival of all species, including ourselves. If there are strong opinions by this group around removing the which needs to be restored, but just acknowledging the other piece, I'm fine with that. But I do think acknowledgement of that is important.
Yeah, but I agree with you that diversity of plants is important. But it's not all that loss of biodiversity is not all because of invasive species. And that's what I object to being in there.
Could we simply say phenological variability and increased ground disturbances altering Vermont's biodiversity, period?
Yes.
I might encourage us just to keep creating an imbalance in Vermont's ecosystems too. I mean, you know what? It's fine. Whatever works.
Well, we could know, Gabby, just to go with it, we see phenological variability and increased ground disturbances altering Vermont's biodiversity and creating an imbalance in Vermont's ecosystems, period, and strike the invasive species clause.
I would.
I think that might be important as well. Hi, everyone. Kai here. I've just been kind of hanging out here. I think that might be important as well, also on a cultural component, because there's some things that have been deemed scientifically as invasive species that are important to different cultures that are not actually invasive. It's just somebody doesn't like the way that they impact their lawn. So, like, so we might want to give some space for things that, may not everything is, but recognizing that it needs to be something that is evolving. It's an evolving understanding of our ecosystems.
Well, an invasive species is a subjective thing. So our state flower, the red clover, is on the invasive plant list in several states, but we honor it.
Well, I'm not sure. See, Alyssa, I think you have the pin here. I'm the PEN. I wonder if we could just strike through by fostering environmental conditions for new invasive species. If we could do a strike through for that clause in the middle there.
So, yeah, I would just do is altering Vermont's biodiversity and creating imbalance in Vermont's ecosystems, period.
Okay, how does that look?
How's that?
Good.
Minor edit, I would just say, is altering Vermont's biodiversity, comma, creating an imbalance, not and creating.
Great.
And that's it.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Good.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Good. Any further on that for now? Okay. Why we're waiting for Jane and Mary to kind of figure out this last piece for this section, and I'm aware of the time. And I know Iris has to go at 10:30, and we have one issue there we need to get to. So I think, co-chairs, what do you think? I wonder, because Iris has to go, we need to come to the one educational language that Judy and Charlie worked on extensively with Kaya's help yesterday, and we'll come back to this section just because I want to get Iris up here. So
Yeah,
Mark,
we should definitely use Iris's time while we have her. So whatever we need to do to accommodate that sounds good.
okay, Billy. Okay. So Marley was kind enough to be willing to project himself. So Marley, I sent you the language for G. We also posted it this morning on the website. Thanks, Abby. So Marley, could you pull up that language I sent you for pathway G? And let's take a look at it.
Yep. You would catch me the 1 minute I go to get a fresh cup of tea.
Yes.
Amazing.
Now, if you drank coffee, I wouldn't have done that.
All right, now, sorry, which one do you want?
It's G, the education pathway G. It's a single word document. It's got one strategy in it.
Oh, Lord. I am
And if you can't pull up, I can. Pull up.
pathway G. Got it.
Okay, great.
I haven't shared on Zoom before, so got it.
So what I want to note is that with Kaya's help, Bill and Charlie had a long and good and important discussion. It was very helpful to recognize work in the state as a whole that has been done around this issue by both the General Assembly and UVM. And there was some reworking of the original language just around strategy and actions. And I'll try to be a little bit more clear about what the background is here. So this is something I think Charlie and Judy, if you want to speak to, worked hard to get to. And so I think the hope would be the group could accept this and include it in that section of the cross-cutting education section. So questions, Charlie and Judy, any comments that you would like to make?
Yeah, I was like really giving Charlie a hard time on the language he was using. And then I began to realize he just didn't know. And so I started giving out documents that would help him to learn. And he was receptive, and I appreciate that, Charlie. So here in this background is some of the things that will help people to understand why this is so important. Both UVM and the state of Vermont's apology letters around eugenics address the language, address changes happening and more being done. And this seemed like the opportune place to make that happen.
Thanks, Judy.
Yeah, thanks, Judy. I mean, I'm fully in a place of listening and learning on this, and I appreciate all of Judy's kind of, prodding me along on that journey. So, yeah, I mean, honestly, out of all the recommendations we're putting forward, I see this one as probably the most challenging, to be honest. But that's not a reason why we shouldn't include it. So, yeah, thanks, Judy.
So, Abby.
Just a couple of things. The first is I just really want to put a pin in the work that was done to get here and the effort and learning. And this was hard to get here. And I think we really need to just take a moment and appreciate what Judy and Charlie really worked really hard to come together to get to this point. And I just want to add that for me, when I read this, to see the quote of soil has little to no agricultural value actually called out to me how important in our context this is as well. Our farm is considered on paper to be not a viable farm, and we've been here for over 150 years, and we do determine land value based on framing like this, and it's partially why a farm like ours was really hard to conserve, for example. And so I think that this while difficult and really challenging and is going to take, education and time and thought, I just really appreciate that we're drawing some attention to the fact there is inherent value in nature, period. And, our language and our thinking around that needs to evolve to be able to see that different things are meant to do different things in the world, right? And that doesn't mean that they don't have value. It just means they're different. And so I just really want to commend the work that went into getting us here, and I'm really appreciative for that.
Thanks, Abby, so much. Other questions or comments about this language? Can we actually, Kaya said, good point for those of us, speaking of differences, can we make that it's slightly bigger, Marley, just on and move it to like 125 or 135%?
That good enough or more?
No, that's much better.
If there are no concerns about this, I think it would be great to just add it into the pathway. But it seems like a really, really great strategy. And I'm so glad that you all took the time to figure this out and work on this.
Thanks, Iris. All right,
Could you just scroll down so we could see all
Yeah,
the
do you want to
actions
see?
Yeah.
That's it.
Great, choose just cut off a little bit on my screen, so you could just, perfect, thank you.
Oh, the one
So-
question I did have, oh, sorry, Billy, go ahead.
I was just thanking everyone for their work on this, and that it looked good to me.
The only thought I have reading number 2 is I don't know if this is an appropriate place to bring in something about the guiding principles or not, to try to tie that in another. I just feel like anywhere that we can draw attention to how important those are going to be to filtering as we move forward, that could be important. But if it doesn't seem like an appropriate place for that, that's fine too.
It's about adding a sentence about referencing the just transitions principles here.
Yeah, I'm fine with it because they incorporated the 4 sustainable questions, looking at land in a certain way and all of that into the guiding principles. So I'm fine with that.
Maybe, Marley, we had something after this that says in commitment to equity, sort of, and like comma or and operationalizing or helping to operationalize the principles in the just transitions work. I'm not sure what the right reference is, but.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure why I can't type into this. Doesn't seem to. Is there anything you have to do in here? Do you have to click annotate or something to be able to
Enable
add?
editing. It's up at the very top. Yeah, that up there.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't know why that did that. Sorry about that, Marley.
Yeah. Say again, and operationalized.
Yeah, and what are the principles actually? What's the official name of the principles?
Guiding principles, isn't it?
Should that be capitalized?
It's guiding principles for a just transition if you want the full.
And we'll capitalize that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kyle. Okay, any other questions or comments about this? And otherwise, we'll, as Iris noted, she'll fold it into that cross cutting section. And triple saying.
I was thinking about this after we finished discussing this, and you guys would know better than I. Would this definition or this suggestion be wise for all the other subcommittees as well? Because I'm not sure they're going through all the equity stuff that we're doing. I'm not even sure they've used the equity matrix that Kaya created.
Judy, I appreciate you raising that. That's something that I would like to request of the Just Transition Subcommittee in their recommendations and their commentaries around that. That this, this has been a great example of how this probably needs to be looked at and interrogated across multiple strategies and divisions of government, because it's,
They don't know. And after I got over the fact that the anger of the comments, I realized it's an educational issue and people just don't know.
Is there a way that we can make sure this gets in front of, or maybe you did last night, I don't know, gets in front of the just transitions and gets folded into some of their cross-cutting as well?
I'll just say that their document is online right now for consideration for the council on Tuesday, and the council meeting will start off on Tuesday by reviewing that implementation section drafted by Just Transitions, with Stu Mittner and Sarah Phillips leading that conversation. So I would encourage folks to one, bring it up then, or offer any written. It's open now for written comments until Tuesday for them to consider as well. And now at their meeting next week, they'll be revisiting what the council edits and suggestions were to that document to make any final revisions.
So our council members on this subcommittee could verbally raise that in next week's in council meeting.
Yeah, but so then what happens, Jane, is if we're expected to use the matrix Kaya created, are we now expected to correct the verbiage they use because they didn't use it? I mean, it's clear when you read.
I'm sorry, who's they? Sorry.
Whoever you were just talking about just posted it. Climate, what did you call the committee?
Oh, sorry, I was referring to the language for implementation of equity in the climate action plan that the Just Transitions Subcommittee wrote, and they speak to three main components of the work going forward, one of which is how the application of the scoring rubric for future iterations of the climate action plan, as well as refinement of the work being brought forward as recommendations in this current climate action plan. So my suggestion was just if you'd like to see stronger or different language that Kaya was suggesting, that now is the time to do that. And the ways to do that would be through speaking up at the council meeting on Tuesday to provide oral recommendations or to provide any written feedback by Tuesday to the Just Transition Subcommittee. But I could be misinterpreting the process or conversation right now, but I was just suggesting that as one avenue to inform the language in the CAP for implementation.
And I do understand that, thank you. But what my question is, in reading and listening to the other committees and what they're writing, the other subcommittees, it's clear they're not using the equity matrix. It's clear in our subcommittee, some people did not use the equity matrix.
Judy, in terms of an action on that, what is your thought for a recommendation or what to do with that?
Well, other than beating people to come into compliance with using the matrix, there's not a whole lot you can do because they're clearly on a timeline that's not going to give them the time to use the matrix.
Well, so just that is in the Just Transitions implementation section, they reflect on the application of the scoring rubric and the limitations based on time, and they speak to the next steps of how to ensure before actions are implemented that it's used. So I would encourage you to look at that language and see if that captures an inadequacy of what we were able to do, which is what they were trying to speak to, and how they recommend rectifying that with future work.
Well, to be blunt, Jane, anything is inadequate because I've been saying since day one, it's not a box to be checked off. It needs to be incorporated in everything discussed.
So I think, I'm not sure, I think the point is both noted and I think also a reality what everyone has faced and what's insufficient or inadequate as noted. I wonder if people can look at the Just Transitions language. I hope that the council members of this subcommittee would bring this particular language up to be considered, also elevated into that section in some fashion, in addition to the education section that we're already putting it in. And maybe for now, that's where it is, and we can certainly continue the discussion next week if we need to about this broader question. So anything else on that for now? And I want to kind of come back to the Office of Climate to see where we are, and then I want to give it a break for public comment. Thank you, Iris, so much. Okay. Jane and Marion, did we get any further on the language for Office of Climate?
Yes, but can you give us till after break for a minute?
Yep.
We're
Sure.
still going back and forth, so just I want to read it. Thank you.
No problem. All right. What co-chairs, what do you think? Should we now? It's about 10:30. Why don't we give a time for public comment now, and then we'll go right back into working through these issues. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
All right. Over to you, Abby, Billy.
So, members of the public, feel free to raise your hands and we'll go from there. Okay, good morning, Cheryl. You want to kick us off? And then Zach and Jennifer.
Good morning, everybody. Sorry about that late email last night, but I was working hard on it and tried to get it to you, and I emailed it because, it didn't go to Iris, it bounced back, so maybe somebody could share it with her. And I did that because I apologize, I thought about it, but I did it because I knew it might take at least more than a week for you all to get it, and it's probably time sensitive. So anyhow, but that isn't what I wanted to comment about right now. What I wanted to talk about was the Land Use Planning Office. There, in my opinion, is there should be two separate offices, and the Planning Office should have a representative in the Climate Office, the Climate Action Office. So there should definitely be a separate land use planning. With regard to career scientists, it's important to see whether they are part of an industry that has financial interest or any interest in the outcome. So, some career scientists, I agree with the statement that was made by I forgot who. And then, of course, it's not always the case. So anyhow, this is a huge priority. It's not a very small priority. It's like probably maybe one of the most important topics is land use planning, and that has huge bearing on climate. It's not effective now with the way that the planning in Vermont works. So an example is here in Chester that there continues to be rural sprawl in our town, and the one new UDB that we had been working on for 3 years and got a grant on was fought against and is lingering and sitting unused for 2 years now, still using the original UDBs that were, I think, developed like in the 70s originally and just kind of amended bit by bit and not very nicely, in my opinion. So that right now the minimum lot size of the entire town at the largest areas, the most rural, is 5 acres. Well, we all know what that means. So that means that we continue to have rural sprawl here. Despite the recommendation coming down from the state and a couple of different agencies, for forest blocks and connectivity and, riparian buffers and et cetera, Act 250 and 171, these things are not effective. And the regional planning offices, well, they try, but they don't really have any power, actually. It's all about the towns. And so here we are with continued rural sprawl. And this is another example of needing, another anecdotal evidence of needing a state level planning office. So I have many other anecdotes to share with you about that, but of course it's time. We don't have the time for that, but I'm happy to share more if you want to hear more about it. Everything that then Lauren spoke and everything that she said is exactly perfectly the description of why we need this. Yeah, that's it. I don't know if this is like too late because public comment just is this little bit of time where, you've already finished with the discussion on that section. So I don't know if you can work that in or if you want to talk more about it. But I think It's of utmost importance to have that state planning, and it shouldn't be under the purview of any other office.
Thank you, Cheryl. And I believe I saw that your email came in, and I did read through it and really appreciate your comments. Just again, want to encourage you that at the end of the day, the Climate Council is who accepts or doesn't accept things that are coming in. And so if you have really strong feelings about something or another, you know, you've been very present in this subcommittee, but not in others, I'm sort of assuming. And so the additional framing of your perspective probably needs to be sent more broadly in order for it to, you know, be seen everywhere that it needs to be.
I'll send it everywhere else.
Okay.
Thank you.
Zach?
Sorry, everybody. I'm just trying to get my video started here. Good morning, Zach Porter, Standing Trees. And I just wanted to thank the subcommittee for its support of Judy's just really important suggestions about how to address really concerning language that we use around, you know, I don't even know, around nature, for lack of a better term to use as a catch-all, and holding up the intrinsic value of all of the natural world, all life, human and more than human. So thank you all for your support of her suggestions there, and that's all I wanted to share at this time.
Thank you, Zach. Jennifer?
Thanks, everyone, for the really important conversations this morning. I wanted to go back and comment on state land use planning, where climate change will find a place in state government and throughout. And I guess the thing that's critically important for me is that there's a collection of individuals like yourself who are thinking about climate change moving forward. And this is going to take funding. This is going to take resources that we may or may not have. And I think all of you have spoken eloquently to one aspect of or this or another. And what I think is that I wouldn't want it needs to be disseminated through the agencies. It needs to be within ANR, but we also can't take away from the other things that employees have to do in ANR, and it needs to be its own entity. It needs to be everywhere. And I don't think that we should delude ourselves and think that the ongoing efforts for climate change are going to be satisfactorily completed with the agencies we currently have. And so I really want to see something like a climate action team. I want to see something, Jane has put in that language, which I'm sure you'll discuss, but it needs to be front and central, and it needs to be disseminated everywhere. And again, that's going to take a lot of resources. That's going to take people, and it's going to take money. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Jennifer. Annette?
Good morning. I wanted to point out that when Act 250 was created, there was at the time something that I think was called an interagency task force. And it would be worth looking into the history of that and see how it worked. The conversation this morning, I really appreciated that you're struggling with where to house something like this new state planning office, because there are all these cross-cutting issues. I'll also point out that one of the ongoing complaints about utility issues is that we need an independent office of public advocacy. And so what I'm sort of thinking is that all of this seems to be bringing together the need for some sort of independent office that incorporates planning, land use, and utility. I mean, for example, AARP has participated for years in rate cases at the PUC, and they a couple of years ago said they're not going to do it anymore because they're doing the job that the Department of Public Service should be doing. And they did ad campaigns and lobbied to the legislature to create an office of independent counsel or something that was doing more than what the politically motivated department was doing. So I hear what Billy's saying about the politicization of these, but I also see that the leadership is politically appointed. So I don't know what structure one could look at for what is a truly independent agency, but all of this seems to be, in my mind, an opportunity to bring together some things that either were abandoned, like the Act 250 Interagency Task Force that had a role in looking at sort of at the statewide issues, and the Office of Planning, and an independent public advocate. Good luck with that. Thank you.
Yeah. But thank you, Annette. Mark, go ahead.
Thanks, Abby. So I watched the Science and Data Subcommittee discuss plan monitoring and evaluation. And so the document that describes this refers to the impacts of climate change on wildlife. It doesn't acknowledge that our climate actions that we take under this plan may themselves have impacts on biodiversity. I asked whose responsibility it was how to figure out how to evaluate those impacts, and I guess it's not theirs. I hear it talked about in this subcommittee, so perhaps it's your job to figure out how to evaluate those impacts. You know, this subcommittee recognizes that there will be impacts, and Lauren's comments this morning seem to indicate that people on this committee understand the potential severity of those impacts. You know, I'm concerned that we're going to come up with a climate action plan that worsens the very most disturbing impact of climate change. And if we are to avoid that, I think that it will be due to the work that this committee does. So I want to encourage you to continue to discuss that and consider it, because you may be the only folks that are doing that. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay.
Looks like that's all our public hands at the moment. Thank you, everybody, for adding your perspective. We really appreciate hearing it. And I think I'll turn it back over to Pat at this moment. Thanks.
Right. Let me share my screen with the language Jane put in chat. Here's what is in the cross-cutting section that came apparently from the cross-sector group about a climate office. And I wonder if people have questions about this and if we could just concur with this language or we need to craft our own. So I want people to take a look. Abby.
Well, my comment to this and to the full council was that one of my suggestions would be that if we're going in the direction of a climate director, I would wonder if we want to make it clear that it should be somebody that's brought in who specifically has a background or training in environmental justice. And I had suggested that to cross-sector. Maybe they denied that. Maybe they didn't accept the changes. I'm not really sure, but it seems like it could be a really critical moment to bring in some of those components together and maybe a more objective viewpoint. If there's going to be one person that's holding all of that work or directing it, it seems like maybe we're in a moment where having an objective viewpoint on how everybody is thinking and talking to each other in an interagency way could be really helpful. Just my thoughts. But again, I offered this in looks like it wasn't accepted, so.
Abby, I added it back in, at least from this committee. So thoughts or questions about this language, other things that we could do to improve it, to maybe be able to kind of put that as a recommendation on the climate council, the climate office.
Just so you know, they just sort of paused working on this when the cross-cutting counselor group was formed. So I don't think it was an intentional oversight. I think it just has sort of dropped a little bit.
How does
That
this
whole time thing, that nasty time thing.
Since this is new, I guess newish language, Abby, now that you're saying that, I'm remembering you bringing this up at full council, however long ago that was, but I'm not sure if this speaks more to that Interagency Office of Climate where regulatory and funding programs are better aligned and executed, or if this is more of the recommendation around something akin to a central planning office that would be responsible for developing and implementing a statewide land use plan. Because it's not, I don't understand which it is closer related to. I don't necessarily currently feel comfortable accepting this language instead of either of those without better understanding of what its overall intent is.
And Lauren, one thought is I think we've come to I think an accommodation on the land use, the central planning office regarding sort of land use planning. And I think we have that, I think. And so this is a separate, distinct one we would include around the climate coordination, for lack of better terms. I'm not sure what the intent of this one is, but this would be just whether we fold this into our recommendations distinctly for the climate office, or we go back to the language we already have, we were trying to work on. Whatever works for the group. And we could add Abby's point into either one.
What does
Pat, your read is that this is more of the interagency coordination and not planning and land use planning.
Right, exactly. That would be my understanding. Judy, you were.
Does RPC mean regional planning committees?
Commission.
Planning commission.
Commission? Okay, thank you.
Spirit of not using acronyms. So again, we're going to leave our land use planning office in conversation that we already had there. This would be this next one around the climate coordination.
And I just want to add, as a point of clarity in response to, I think, Cheryl's comments earlier around the issues she's having with local planning and with this number 2. And someone correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no legal authority for the state to do state land use planning. Land use planning rests currently with municipalities. They have the opportunity to make town plans. There's certain requirements of regional planning commissions in Chapter 117 of state statute. But the aspirational things of having a state planning office dictate land use planning decisions at the local level is not authorized right now. There would need to be laws that would provide that ability to the state. So, this is a little bit of a cart before the horse thing, in that the state can't do many of the things that folks are asking it to do at this time. I just want to make sure everyone understands that. And if I have that wrong, please correct me, but I believe that's the case.
Judy.
I'm not sure who it is that can oversee the regional planning commissions, but in our town, just down the road from us, somebody retired and he was in agriculture, and he applied to take 7 acres and make it into a solar panel array, and the town did not approve it, and he appealed to somebody at the state and it got approved. So my guess is there is laws someplace that allow it to be overturned, because it happened here.
Judy, to that really good point, there were some Vermont Climate Council comments too on some of the language we had around citing renewables on natural and working land. So we're going to come back to that because we've got to look at that too. Okay, so on just the climate office, I want to just test, and I'm aware of time. We have some of the good things we want to get through. Is this language as amended okay to be for our recommendation for the climate office only? or is there, we need to do something else? And wanna get a
I
sense?
would still feel more comfortable if we folded in some more of our language that specifically speaks to permitting programs, funding and implementation around climate related efforts. Because right now it seems pretty vague. And I think we have some good language that Alyssa's captured over time that should be folded in.
So I wonder, well, let's do this. I think Lauren, to that point, if we can come back to this at the end of the day to try to do some of that, or we may have to task, if Alyssa's willing, to try to kind of fold the two things together and then send around an email after. I think just because of other issues we need to get to, let's note this language plus the language that Alyssa already worked on, and we'll come back at the end to figure out how to kind of pull that together, if we could. Jane.
Yeah, this is like real-time edits to documents that are posted for the council's review right now. So I'm struggling a little bit, and it's just a time thing with how to handle this appropriately. So there's a couple of different things. There is a survey online for counselors right now, specifically around the cross-cutting pathways section, asking them to identify gaps, issues, omissions. And so I really encourage that this language is obviously not right by everybody here. So we should make sure this is something that is discussed by the council on Tuesday's agenda. And so one obvious way to get it there is to lift it up through the survey online that counselors are asked to do. And some small tweaks, or Marion and I should probably just reflect on this. This was an omission in the document as posted right now. We've made an edit from what we should have put there based on cross-sector stopping their work on it. So we might want to just handle these revisions through you all reaching consensus and then them being elevated on for Tuesday's discussion with the council.
Okay, I'm gonna put this on pause only because of other things we get to, because we talked about this a fair amount, but I'm hearing Lauren's suggestion we try to fold the language collectively together. We'll figure out how to do that before we end today. Okay. I'm gonna go to David. I'm gonna come back to biomass in a second, but I want to jump just because I've got the same document open. David Mears, you had said we had a long conversation about no net loss versus net gain for wetlands, and a robust conversation. And David, you worked on some language. So David, I just took your language and put it into this document. So do you want to kind of explain what you did, and then we'll have a conversation about it?
Great, thanks. Yeah, and I've sent emails with this language to folks if they want to pull up on out of their email, and I just put it in the chat. Thank you for putting it up there, Pat, and really thank you to Ryan for prompting me to remember this conversation. I had a good exchange with him, and I'll just share for context. You may recall we suggested, we had a discussion about whether to include language. It had a fairly simple statement of adopt a policy of a net gain of wetlands, and didn't really answer the question about how to achieve that policy. And it raised uncertainties for a number of this subcommittee about what that actually meant. And yet there was, I think, a consensus that wetlands are a really critical part of our overall working lands and natural land strategies. So this is an effort to try to capture that. And one, it includes some language that you should have seen before, that number one, which is underlined, which is some additional language suggesting that if we're going to adopt a policy of no net loss, for instance, we need to know what our baseline is, and we need to keep track of how we're measuring and evaluating the kind of ebb and flow of lands as they move into different categories. But then the second part is new that you have not seen before, which was, instead of talking about a net gain policy, describe it as a strategy, with the idea that it's, whatever comes of this recommendation is that if the state developed this, that it would be presumably a set of recommendations to be adopted into a policy of rules and perhaps legislation. So strategy was a key word here. Another piece was some of the wetlands that are, I think there's a fairly broad agreement, with the possible exception of some really, there may be some that are opposed to Class 1 wetlands being protected and enhanced, but on the assumption that this was an area where we all agreed that was a top priority was to identify and protect and restore Class 1 wetlands, to call them out. And then making the third point was to make the point that we don't intend by increasing the amount of area in functioning wetlands, then we're not intending to reduce the amount of land that's in forest land, other kind of natural lands, or agricultural lands. So that's what this language is intended to address, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Questions or comments about the effort to accommodate the variety of interests that we heard last time? Judy.
There we go. So for me, that comes down to what I've been dealing with for years. So in the Burlington intervale, the compost facility filled class 1 wetlands with leachate, high in arsenic, lead, and carcinogens, basically destroying them. And it took me 7 years to fight that. And finally, they were asked to be removed. The class 1 wetlands, there's nothing that monitors or mandates that they stop doing what they're doing. A&R was supposed to monitor, and they did come out, but there was nothing that stopped it from continuing to happen. And there was nothing to that there was like no reprimand for ruining class 1. So that's the issues I have with this. I mean, I love protecting class 1 wetlands, the idea, but who monitors this? What are the checks and balances if people don't do it? Because people often use wetlands as their private dump, their private backyard dump.
Judy just added a little bit of potential language to that point.
Yeah, I know, I see that, but my questions are, and we've talked about this, if A&R only follows the strategies and the policies they have, and there's no enforcement component, and the monitoring component comes when someone complains, then who's going to do that?
John?
This is the frustrating part, Judy, about an awful lot of what is mandated in our state, and probably true of states all over on countries everywhere. We have rules about not burning trash, and yet trash is burned all the time. When you call, and we've had this issue in my town, and when you call, the state police or the sheriff, they're not interested in, many times they're not interested because they're too busy with what they consider more serious crimes. I live, not next to, but in my town is the Cornwall Swamp, one of the greatest wetlands in the state. It is not a class 1 wetland, or it is not at this point. There was an attempt by several conservation commissions around it to have it made a class 1, which I supported, but it sort of founded on, oh my God, we can't interfere with the private property rights of certain people who border. What's the risk to them? And yet we know that Cornwall Swamp saved the town of Middlebury. I say that boldly, but I think the evidence is there during Irene. If it hadn't been there, I think the center part of Middlebury might well have disappeared. But anyway, it's mainly a comment that we rely on people, neighbors, et cetera, to complain or draw attention to these issues, but then there isn't the enforcement capability. We're just, when you start adding up what it all costs, we haven't yet fessed up to the fact that if we're going to protect these things, it's going to require more robust enforcement in some ways.
Ryan.
Thanks. I think the proposal here does a really good job of elevating the interconnected relation between different land uses. I would not support the addition of the term class 2 into the second part of the C2 there. I think identifying those wetlands that are, of exemplary natural conditions that they warrant the highest level of protection is, definitely something to support. And I think that class 1 wetland is appropriate. Where the strategy focuses on regulating the use of class 2 or class 3 wetlands, I think that the state policy we have in place is sufficient to protect any of those wetlands from conversion or uses that are not allowed uses and not permitted. And I do think there is significant authority for enforcement of violations to those standards. It can be quite pricey as well. So I think this is really can speak to the planning and understanding in the face of a changing climate and changing settlement behaviors by people to best understand where and if additional restrictions or authorities are needed. And as drafted, and if you add the associated monitoring enforcement in there, I'm fine with that too. But as written, I would certainly support this language.
Any other comments on this before we try to move on? Judy, David Mears.
Just a quick thing on the class 1, class 2. I intentionally wrote it so it says an initial focus on highest quality wetlands with a reference to class 1 so that people understood what the starting point is. And I would note also that there's a process in state law to designate new wetlands as class 1 wetlands. So it doesn't necessarily only apply to existing wetlands. The agency has the authority to grow that. So that's the initial focus. And it was a goal to try to get this to consensus language. So it may not include everything that everyone wants, but I'm recommending it.
And again, I want to see if we can move this forward. Sorry for this background noise in my case. John, over to you.
I think that's a residual hand.
Okay. Can people live with this language so we can move it forward? Anybody who wants to try to work it further before we include it? Thank David's hard work and move on. Anybody else? Any other comments? Okay, David, we'll fold that back into that section. So thanks so much for the good work. Really appreciate it. There's a question about I guess, about if does this language mean, David, if we lose wetlands but working lands increase, we are still at no net loss?
I don't know. These are fairly broad concepts. That's a fairly specific question. And, I think the spirit of all of this is the consensus. If there's any consensus among us, I think it's that we want to increase the amount of and the capacity of our natural and working lands to store and sequester carbon and add to our climate resilience. And so all of this language should be interpreted with that goal in mind.
Any other comments on that? Committee's welcome to look in the chat. I'm aware of time and we have to kind of keep moving. And I know it's that annoying clock thing that keeps coming up for us. All right, I'm gonna move on for now then. Certainly people can make a public comment as we need to in a little bit. Okay, let me close out of this document. Marley, do you mind pulling up the biomass document? So just a little bit of background on this. Again, Judy and Charlie worked really hard with Kaya's assistance to kind of try to reach an approach to biomass recognizing the Climate Council had a number of comments on it. Judy and Charlie took those into account, but really wanted to recognize the spirit of this subcommittee. And so they did a fair amount of work. It was posted this morning. We can try to see if people can read this online a bit. The general thrust and alternative, Charlie and Judy, if they want to add more, or Kaya, is to be clear about the language up front. There was some comment about expansion, which they define, which we can look at and hear, and that generally we're kind of neutral on whether or not biomass for thermal is promoted or not. But if it is, there are conditions that need to be met, and that's what this recommendation seeks to describe. So Judy and Charlie, before we kind of let people kind of read through this, Judy and Charlie, Kai, anything you want to add about the discussion about biomass?
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I think you framed that well, Pat, that I think that in writing this, we tried to essentially not craft public policy, but set out the principles to inform public policy. So not be overly prescriptive, but kind of set out kind of principles and guardrails. Pat makes a good point that there's definitely not a consensus on whether we want to support this or not. I don't know if that rises to something to be put in that later section about kind of not disagreements, but things that are taken on different parts. But yeah, that's pretty neutral on, you know, we're not supporting it. We're not, you know, saying don't do it. We're just kind of laying out, you know, here are the broad principles. And I think if you read through it, it hopefully reads in a way where it kind of addresses the large scale issues. It then gets into just kind of the larger concepts around the use of biomass, and then it gets at specifically the use of pellets as to that discussion. And then the last part is just around kind of next steps around education, and there's some stuff around enforcement in there. The one thing I will ask is just on that, I can send this note, but there's some examples here around sawdust and sawmill residues, and there's one edit I just want to make there around taking out the word cants and just putting in shavings, because cants is a different kind of thing.
Harley, can you see that word right there? Maybe we just actually change that to shaving. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's super minor. It's still the same thing. It's just that the cants language is kind of getting at something different. So anyway, but I'll let Judy chime in with any of her suggestions. And again, thanks for good conversation on this and working through it.
Judy or Kaya, anything else to add about the work done here?
Yeah, it was not easy, but we got through it, and pretty much that's all I can say. It's that it was the language that was holding us up, and once we came to agreement on the language in the first part you presented, then we were able to move through.
Thanks, Judy. Abby.
Again, really know what went into getting us here, and really appreciate the hard work that was put in by both of you to do that. I'm sorry, days are blending together, but the council, there was a lot of discussion about our recommendations in this arena from the council, and I believe most of the concerns were around any potential recommendations we were making that weren't allowing for thermal applications of biomass, but maybe somebody else that was at the council can help me with that too. And I just want to make sure that whatever we've gotten to here isn't just going to go up. Well, actually, I guess they don't know the procedure for that. Maybe we can just send it up to the full council and they just strike it. I think that would be really awful, but I just want to flag that it was clear that this degree of nuance had not been explored in other discussions of biomass. And so I just want us to note that, and you know, that I am not certain where this will go at the council level.
Charlie, do you want to, because we did have some conversation about the council's comments.
Yeah, I think we tried to address as much of the council's feedback that we got and what we heard at the meeting. Yeah, you're right. I don't even know what day it is, to be honest. Whenever that happened, we tried to address their feedback. I will say that like one thing here that's gonna be a conflict for the council, I can see it coming, is this around expansion and increased efficiency. And the one thing that I think we tried to make it really clear about was, to Judy's point about expansion and what that means to the physical impact of documented cultural and historical sites. And Judy, please correct me or clarify that better. But I think that's an area where there's going to be conflict at the council, because there could potentially be things that might be getting at better efficiencies, but if they negatively impact those resources that are documented, then that is a huge issue. And we didn't try to square that, I think, but we tried to highlight that as being, you know, a major issue. And that's really just specific to, I think, big plants in the McNeil specifically. I think everything else we tried to address as clearly as we could. I'm still not sure what cross-sector mitigation is doing. Jared implied that they had done a ton of work on this, but we have not seen anything to that end. So if there is something out there, please forward it. But I do think we tried to address their considerations or concerns as best we could.
Well, the other thing we didn't address, because it wasn't an issue for them apparently, is both of these places are built in floodplains. And so, like in the case of McNeil, to protect themselves from the flooding, they had to build 4-foot berms around themselves. And so that's not in here because they didn't address it, but there shouldn't be building in a floodplain. It's only going to continue to flood.
Marley, could you go back up to the expansion language one more time? I just want to be explicit about what this, so you all are clear about what you're recommending. So yeah, it goes to E. You want to look at fully E is the key word there, because that defines expansion. So what I think that what Charlie and Judy work out, being cognizant of the Vermont Climate Council's comments, but also being really clear that physical footprint expansion is going to impact floodplains, as you just said. It's going to impact existing cultural resources that have not been adequately protected already, and any number of other things. So the notion is, if you can make it more efficient, great, but you've got to stay within the footprint. So that's how that is defined.
That relate to proposals to do a district heating loop from McNeil. Obviously, there's an expansion of impacts associated with the thermal loop that would be required.
Yeah, and I've seen pictures of that, and that's bigger than what they already are.
Yeah, Billy, that's gonna be where this kind of hits conflict, and I don't think we have a solution to that. But I think that what this is trying to do is elevate that concern around what that physical expansion means.
So, as I've said before too, this particular land, McNeil, has been placed on the State Historical Register for the most sensitive archaeological site in the state.
The other,
yeah, I'm just trying to understand the intent here. So it sounds like the intent is that any expansion beyond the existing footprint, it would not be permitted.
Correct.
I also want to note that, you know, I did encourage when we were introducing this to the council that any members who had been working on biomass in other subcommittees were welcome to attend this meeting to try to understand better the deeper nuances that we were trying to work with. And I don't think anybody's here, which, to be honest, is a bit frustrating because, you know, at different points, we've all gone to other committee meetings when there have been things we were concerned about to sort of try to hear those perspectives and what they were working through. So it's too bad nobody's here to understand how we've come to this.
And it's hard, right? Like for a long time, have been a huge advocate of like the opportunity for district heating. And I think that there's potential like net GHG kind of climate things we can actually improve there. But, you know, in talking and learning from Judy, like I totally see the impact of that expansion. And again, I don't have the solution, and I just want to set you guys, Billy and Abby, up. I apologize in advance that we're throwing you to the wolves with this. Have fun. Good luck with that, as it was pointed out earlier. But
we know.
So this is a great example of one of those things where, you know, multiple things, you know, in this work are going to conflict, you know, so.
And I would be happy to throw you to the bunnies and come to the meeting with you if I have advance notice, but to learn, like, you know, the day before, a couple hours before, is difficult.
Yes, I'm sorry, Judy, that I didn't give you more. But yeah, I mean, I think certainly just give you know, as long as Billy and I know the context, we'll do the best that we can to try to carry the torch. That's the best we can do. I can't tell you what the council is going to agree to or not.
Yeah.
But really do appreciate the work.
So for McNeil to expand and add the steam collection process they want, they have to build a facility that's acres big in a highly sensitive area that's a floodplain.
I know, Jude, I'm not, like I said, I do think in this subcommittee, we have gone on, for lack of a better term, a learning journey here, right? I think there has been some perspective broadening and things that have happened in this subcommittee. I just don't.
It just hasn't happened.
This is going to become a tension point at the full council level, and I don't know how that's going to play out there. That's all I want to make clear.
And I think that I want to just test, I think the underlying principles that we want this subcommittee to come to consensus to the extent it can, to certainly take very seriously the comments of the Vermont Climate Council. That does not necessarily mean you have to agree with them in your recommendations, and then the Climate Council needs to take them up, as Abby just noted. So I just want to test if anybody has any other questions or concerns about this, and otherwise we will fold this into sections pathway C.
I do. Number sub D of A that says existing facilities need to be closed if they don't meet the above criteria. That was another clear point of feedback we got from the council, that the existing facilities are currently operating under lease or under license agreements that, I don't think anyone has any ability to terminate. So the notion that these would just be closed if certain criteria established by this subcommittee were not met I don't think is real. I think if this is characterized in the context of a relicensing or the renewal of contracts, then I think that is more plausible. So I think if we want to be responsive to the council's feedback, making those changes might be advisable.
Okay, in the chat box, there's Abby saying that last until 2024. So
I believe that was what Liz Miller said, was that there's lease contracts until, or something in statute, or I can't remember, but something until 2024 that would mean there couldn't be anything done until then, was the takeaway that I had from her.
Yeah, my only point was that any recommendations should be tied to kind of the renewal of license or contracts. That's where we'll have the most influence.
Well, actually, that's the problem. A&R always wants them to come in compliance. We need to not have them come in compliance. We need them because it takes forever, Charlie. I mean, Billy, you know that. You've seen it. It could take 10 years for them to come into compliance.
That's not what I'm talking about here. I was just suggesting that we tie this recommendation, these conditions, to any updated license or contract with the plans. But that's just a suggestion.
That's fine. If the facility operations cannot be sufficiently improved to address the above prior to renewal of their license in 2024, the facility should be closed? Is that what you're saying?
I think that is a more effective approach if that's the intent, yes.
Yeah, I think the original language that was in that draft was looking at, renewal of the license would be the trigger.
Yeah.
And for the reasons that you articulated, Billy, that just legal process, that would be the trigger. It wouldn't be a case of just shutting it.
Judy, what do you think about the language Marley just added?
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's fine because we're talking about the largest polluter in the state. We can't keep giving them a chance. They've had 20 some odd years to have a chance to get better and they haven't done it.
Marley, it is an editorial. The facility should be closed and job transition assistance provided. I think that's just an editorial. Yeah, we got it there. There we go. Yeah. did that. Okay, so with
Do-
those,
There, Cheryl Joy did suggest then the license will not be renewed, which might just be like a more succinct way to end that recommendation.
could be prior renewal of current license, then the license will not be reviewed. And I think we do want to be explicit about the facilities closing. That's really why we have that in there, but I think you could add, then the license will not be renewed as a middle sentence.
Yeah, I'm not following where you want that, Abby, sorry.
The operation cannot be sufficiently improved to address the above prior to renewal of current license. The license should be denied. Then the license should be denied.
How's that? Is that right?
Yes.
Just add a then there, I think, then the license should be denied. Then statement, so yeah. Good. And the facility should be closed. No, you got it right. Never mind, you got the right. There's three things, so you're good. Sorry. Okay. Charlie, final thoughts on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to make just one kind of broader kind of overview, I guess, just put it out there. You know, the McNeil plant, for all of its faults that we've articulated, is a current market for a certain kind of product. And I'll leave that at that. And that those markets are in a situation now where they are in not a great place as far as it relates to the forest product economy in Vermont, in the Northeast. And I do think that what we're talking about here does tie to a larger kind of systems thing that we are trying to think about in terms of, you know, overall harvest levels and what we do with wood, and this idea that if it's possible to find different uses that employ those products in a better way, this all kind of happens in a system. And so I just want to kind of, like, all the things we're talking about, this is one piece of a much larger system. And as we tinker with parts here, we have to understand the effects here. And I think we're doing that. But I just want to, like, I don't know, put that out there to keep that in mind for all these things that as we tinker with parts of a system, it has impacts elsewhere that we need to and are trying to take into account. So that's it.
What I'd like to suggest is that if there's not any further comments, we fold this to pathway C as written with the changes. Marley, thank you, and we move on. Any further comments from members here before we do so? Okay, in pathway E, and Abby, you can address this. There were a few comments from the council members about some of the, and actually maybe a few in E and E, about how some of the food security or food insecurity or kind of tied to the farm to plate strategic plan, how those issues related to climate. And so I think you made a good case for this already, but you just want to explain that, Abby, and we'll put that in the response to comments.
Yes, and so sorry I haven't gotten to that. Again, my week ran away from me, but that is my intention. It just seems like I need to be much clearer in how I wrote it in terms of how climate change impacts food security and make those connections very clear, which I believe I did do at the council level. And so I'll just try to transition that language into that. I think we're all on that same page here, that we understand the enormity of climate change and food insecurity. So I don't think I need to go into it further. I just need to fix it in the language in the draft, but let me know if that's not the case.
Okay, great. I just want to kind of make that just to kind of cover all the issues they raised, but if that's the case, terrific, thank you, and we can move forward. And I think Abby made a good case at the council itself about the link between food security and climate is completely linked, and the pandemic is exhibit one. Okay, the next issue, and I'm going to project the comments, is this is regarding some climate council comments around the siting of renewables on natural and working lands. So let me project my screen and let people read these, and then we kind of talk about if there's any changes you all want to make to the document. So bear with me a second and find this thing. Okay, so these are the comments of either in the meeting. It's the red just means it was a different day, so don't worry about the red. Just that was on the 10th versus the 9th. But these are essentially comments that were summarized by the facilitator of the Climate Council, my colleague David Plum. Marley tried to capture some of it as well. So this is kind of the three things, those three boxes of comments the council has made, and then we can talk about what, if anything, to do.
I just want to note that Billy put some stuff in the chat that I
Yeah, I want to
I
come back.
just want to better understand.
Yeah, let me, Abby, can we,
I'm sorry.
can I circle, let me see if we can do renewables, circle back,
Sure.
and please remind me so I don't forget to Billy's point.
Yep.
Okay.
Tell me if you can, I'll take them off.
Okay, so questions, so just give people a minute to read this first, and then we'll have a conversation. And David, we can pull up the section F if needed.
And I'm just gonna, while everybody's reading through this, I'll just add a tiny bit of context. Some of my, I suppose, rebuttal at the council level to particularly the first concerns, I gave the example of how our farm had handled this and the fact that I see this almost as a component of a type of social cost of carbon, in that the upfront investment to site renewables on existing infrastructure does cost more initially, but the benefit of keeping the renewables off the land base as much as possible is worth that expense, in my personal opinion and experience. So there's that context that I just wanted to add, that I did add at the council level. Whether that will make a difference or not, I don't know, but that was how I tried to frame it.
David Mears.
I just note that, this is the way our system has been set up. It creates a priority for inexpensive and cheap electricity, which has been the reason we have, for so long relied on fossil fuels and as the primary source. And when we, as a state, decided we want to invest more in efficiency, it meant that we paid more at higher rates. When we decided we wanted to incentivize renewables, it meant we paid higher rates. Those are decisions we make all the time. So this suggesting that we prioritize renewables in areas that are already developed, even though there may be additional infrastructure cost, is completely consistent with past policy and approaches, and doesn't create a unique or different equity issue. With that said, I think we should absolutely, the overall system of how people pay for their electricity should have equitable considerations in it. I'm not sure that I see a unique obligation for our recommendation relating to where it's cited as one that should be called out for a specific additional obligation to recognize equity impacts.
Right. Good point.
Just to jump in, we had a pretty extensive discussion with the council. I think the only substantive comment was someone taking issue with the word require incentives in sub B of our existing language.
Well, that's very helpful to figure out what actually we should.
I think basically Liz Miller said, it's fine to recommend incentives and incentivize things. She wasn't comfortable requiring something without knowing the rate impacts. But I think everything else that was discussed is consistent with our existing language.
See, there's other question that comes, and Billy, I'll try to find that language in just a second here. So,
that's right, Billy. Thank you so much for that. That's right. That was what Liz was saying, was that it was the require, literally the word require. And if we changed that, I think she said she was comfortable.
Okay, so I think I've got this. Let's see if I actually do. Okay, I think it's that C, right, Billy? So it's this require right here.
Yes.
Okay. So if we said provide, what's the revision? Offer, provide.
I think it's just incentivize.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or
Yeah.
consider incentives. I think that was the word she suggested instead of require was consider. Just so that it gave a little bit of flexibility in terms of, not mandating or requiring was just the concern.
I feel better about that saying incentivize citing new renewables, not just consider incentivizing. It's like really, really weak, and might open ourselves up for pretty significant different interpretations.
David Mears, I think you're trying to get on there via your phone or something. Go ahead.
Sorry, no, I was not actually trying to get on. That was
okay, no worries. So how about that? Sorry.
Just a question. So a question about this change. I don't know if it actually changes the underlying concern that Liz had. So I think as a subcommittee, if our recommendation is to incentivize these, on lots, rooftops, and other altered locations, are we comfortable with making that recommendation regardless of the rate impact? Because in saying incentivizing it doesn't really change the meaning of saying require the incentive. We're saying our recommendation is to, yes, incentivize, make that a requirement, whether that word is there or not. I just don't know if that changes the underlying meaning. And so, I'm just wondering, and to David's point is, regardless of the rate impact, is it something that, we want to be recommending because it's a practice that over time will actually be, and to Abby's point, something that will ultimately be more cost effective. I don't know. I just don't know if this change actually will alter the substantive feedback or critique that came from Liz.
I mean, I wonder if, Jake, to that point, and whatever the exact wording is, but we maybe need to add either in the tables below or even in this action a little bit more clarity to David's point about this has been a typical practice across a number of things, and that we are aware of the equity impacts that need to be addressed. And to Abby's point, the reason we're doing this is because it provides an overall climate benefit over time. So maybe we just need some more explanation. What do people think?
Going back to Liz's comments, she was suggesting if we do want to promote incentives that we broaden the source of those incentives that come from individuals other than electric customers.
So
I'm not advocating for any outcome here. I'm just trying to provide clarity on what the comments that we received are.
And we aren't clear on the mechanism to incentivize on any of these, right? So we have to be specific, or is that something to let the Climate Council take up if they want?
No, I mean, I can't remember. I mean, I know she and I have talked about sort of the implementation of REAP grants and the accessing of that. And I don't know whether I'm sorry, I can't remember whether that was some of it. I think she was just trying to make sure that there was flexibility around the burden only being held by electricity customers, and that there were many different ways to sort of balance the additional infrastructure cost of building on existing infrastructures and things like that, aside from just putting it on electric customers.
Right, if these are sites that require a capital investment to make the site itself suitable for the infrastructure, that seems like a cost that there's other ways to subsidize it that aren't necessarily going to affect the energy rates of electricity customers. So if there's, I don't know if we if we can somehow sort of
maybe we incorporate some of what. Sorry, Jake.
Go ahead.
Ali put something in the chat that maybe helps make the argument. better than I did.
I would strongly recommend we do what we need to do to address the council's comments and move on. We've got about 25 minutes left, and I have to stop at noon personally. I think we still have a lot of work to do. We got a specific comment from a council member. We can either be responsive or not, but we need to move on.
So yeah, so I think that's right. So I think if people are okay, I'm going to change the red language. So to Jake's point, it may be a distinction without a difference. I think in terms of the response to the councilor's comment, because there's a response to comments, I can work with whoever's section this is. I think it's David Muir's section, and we can rather than put this in the recommendation, we can respond to her comment in the response to comments chart and explain our thinking, and it would be responsive to her without necessarily changing significantly this. Lauren, over to you.
Yeah, to Sonia's good point in the chat. I think it would be helpful too if we added parking lots, comma, rooftops, comma, transportation rights of way where applicable. I know that there are a lot of opportunities to cite renewable energy in a lot of different rights of ways for transportation. Other states and countries are doing that pretty regularly. So thanks for that recommendation.
So I think unless people feel differently to Billy's point of keeping us moving, what I have in italics here is we'll put into the response to comments to the counselor, so we're responsive, but we'll only make the modest changes we just described here for now. Okay, any other comments on that?
Patrick, I got disconnected at one point. What was her recommendation?
She was concerned about require incentives versus encourage or the like, and if there are incentives provided, to try to provide incentives outside of ratepayers, for instance, from grants from USDA or wherever they might come from, I think.
You mean for builders or?
I mean, again, I'm not sure. I guess her concern is ratepayers have to foot the bill. And David Mears, I don't know if you heard this, said that a lot of our incentives for renewables do have the ratepayer foot the bill for a whole set of things. It's been a pretty standard practice over the years.
Because like I'm thinking of like UMass Amherst and Echo Center, when they created the parking lots, they just did it themselves. It didn't go on to any taxpayer or what do I want to say?
I don't know if that's accurate. I believe the project, I could be wrong with this, but I believe the Echo Center is a net meter project that received a subsidized rate from the state with a preferred adjuster because it was at a parking lot location. So there's existing subsidies and incentives to do this exact work right now.
Right.
That is shared amongst all ratepayers. That benefits particular customers. So,
okay, that's what I'm getting at. It's not, there wasn't a specific rate increase that addressed them. There was grants. I know UMass Amherst got grants.
What I'm going to suggest is maybe if we can, is we will figure, David can work, and I'll support you, David, in kind of figuring out the response to the counselor's concern, and we'll include the red language changes that we have here. If that's okay. Any other conversation on that before we go to the next? Let's save this. Billy, I want to come back to your comment about the Climate Council, and then I want to go on to Ryan and talk about net versus gross emissions, where we had some counselor comments again. So Billy, I want to just test. So are you saying that you are, I just want to be clear, I think the group was going to include that, was going to work on the language around the Climate Council folding together trying to think which language, Billy, you had a comment on biomass, sorry. On the biomass language, you said you don't consent, but you'll let it go forward. I just want to be clear about what your intent was.
We didn't talk about some of these other sections about utilizing research to inform if and under what conditions biomass and institutional residential applications are for, like, I don't understand B. I don't, like, who is using this information, who has the right to approve these. I don't understand what that's doing. If I want to buy a pellet boiler for my house right now, are you saying that I need to go through some process under this sub B to determine whether I can do that?
Shirley, do you want to give a crack at that? So in part B, I think that really there was some debate about what actually the research says and shows, and to really, it's a complicated issue in which certainly our group didn't have time to sort out all the research and come to any conclusion on it's on what it actually all means collectively. And so the thought is that this is really to say is before we kind of jump into promoting actively biomass of any kind, that generally the thought is to do some research in the state, which had set its policy based on the best evidence collectively. I think that's its primary intent. But Charlie or Judy, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think it was. Also, we had in this discussion the outside boilers that people have in their yards. And that we talked about the complexity of what John mentioned earlier. You know, Charlie gave an example of someone burning Pampers and trying to get the constable there. It's so difficult to get enforcement.
What was your broader question though, Pat, about?
Billy, maybe Billy should state the question again, Charlie.
It just wasn't clear to me. It sounds like the intent of that sub B or whatever it is to do more research and have a definitive understanding of what the greenhouse gas implications are of these different applications, which is fine. I just read it as, you know, you utilize existing research to inform if and under what conditions biomass can be used for. It seemed like it was a condition of people using these technologies for thermal purposes. And I don't think that's the intent. The language was just a little, the language of to inform if and under what conditions biomass can be used for thermal heating. It seemed like it was going to impact some sort of like regulatory thing. And I don't think that's the intent. I was just
no. I think the intent was just to say, as we consider public policy around these things, look to the existing research or new research, and then I don't have the document open, but like, and then I think below that we kind of highlight principal areas of research or principal areas. So yeah, I think your interpretation of it is correct as I understand it, Billy.
All right, that's fine. Thank you for clarifying it.
So then, Billy, are you okay with this then moving forward in terms of folding into our pathway state?
You know, I don't know. I have real concerns about the impact on the forest product sector from this stuff. We've got no information or testimony on it. You know, this is a fairly significant recommendation, but I'm not going to stand in the way of it moving forward. Yes.
Okay.
Are you going to promote it when you present it?
I'm going to do what I've done all along and say this is what the subcommittee is recommending. I don't honestly think we're presenting anything at this point. I think our opportunity to present stuff before the council is over, but I could be wrong with that. I think we're just providing written updates at this point.
So this will go into the next draft that will be posted for the Climate Council. I think Billy's saying he's concerned, but doesn't want to stand in the way of it moving forward.
And I think, Billy, your point about, you know, we haven't had much time, we haven't had much testimony is a good one. And I think one of the intentional things here was to kind of, again, not write public policy, but present principles to inform public policy. And the intent would be that as they develop that policy in the legislature or rulemaking or whatever, that's when we'd want to have much more kind of input and discussion from the forest product sector. Because I agree with you, but I think that was kind of the intent.
Okay, thank you.
All right, next is ag mitigation. So Ryan, there were a number of comments that came from the Climate Council around the kind of on the agriculture mitigation section around net versus gross emissions. And I don't know if you can address those and pull them up if need be. I wasn't, so this has been a long-standing conversation we've been having with them.
Well, I saw one comment in the ag mitigation section repeated in section 14 on sequestration and storage. And I think what we have here is something similarly that happened with the first passage of Act 168 of 2006, which establish greenhouse gas reduction targets for the state, which the Global Warming Solutions Act amended to become requirements. But it wasn't until 2008 that a definition of what is a greenhouse gas was defined by subsequent legislation. And so the need to look to the law and the direction it provides, and to elevate the concept that there's something missing when it comes to the ag forestry or the land use sector that was published after that first 2006 law was passed. So that law was passed in May 22nd, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published the Ag Forestry and Other Land Use Synthesis in July of that year. And so all of this conversation around emissions, inventory, while the Climate Council has accepted, of course, that the current inventory works for our fossil fuel-based sectors, it's also put forward the need for an RFP to better research and understand, well, since EPA hasn't integrated this framing and synthesis, the state of Vermont needs to look at it, especially in the light of emission reduction requirements. And so narrowly for this, one thing I heard was it's different, and it is different. And so acknowledging that this land use sector is different and requires a distinct accounting, and that there is both work happening on the Climate Council front, and the legislature also needs to consider the framework that is put forward for the ag forestry and land use sector is something that's going to be embedded in our response to comments. I don't think anything that's in the Section 14 sequestration language is an attempt to derail the current gross emissions process that the state has for fossil fuel-based sectors. That's been well vetted and accepted by the Climate Council, and we're not suggesting anything like that. We're suggesting, well, the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee and the Ag Forestry of the land use sector is different and does need to be quantified distinctly. So that's my general response, and I think it's well supported by not only the council itself by its advancement of the RFP, but by literature and broader international policy on that front. So to that end, that was how, if there is a form, I guess my question is there a form for response to comments? Because I've worked to try to draft some and happy to provide information to that effect to the group. But it's the same conversation we've been having, and we're not trying to upset the apple cart. We're just trying to say this is a different sector and it does need to be quantified distinctly, and that's acknowledged internationally.
Ryan, yes, there is. In fact, at the end here, I'll describe. I have two response to comments charts developed: one for sequestration and storage, one for the resilience and adaptation, and then we need to do a third for mitigation one. And then I'm going to put that on a Google Doc. And as long as we don't have a quorum, people can add into it, so we have one document with all the responses, because different people are going to work on different responses. Okay. Any other questions about that or thing? It sounds like we don't need any changes in the recommendations. We do need to respond to the comment with some clarity. Any other questions about that? Okay, Lauren, I know on land use there were, we want maybe just be clear about what moved into the cross-cutting, and if there was some language you were going to work on to just make sure there was a connection between the two sections. But did you want to speak to the land use pieces?
Yeah, I just pulled over, we had 4 actions, 2 of which were pretty vague general terms and 2 which were more specific into the compact settlement cross-cutting pathway, which is in section 15 and I think is up on the council website for review. I have Billy noted, and I totally agree that there should still be acknowledgement of the value of compact settlement from an ag and ecosystems perspective in our section of the plan. So I drafted 2 or 3 sentences to that effect that acknowledge it within our work. I need to send it to David still. I forgot to do that prior to this, but yeah, I think it's pretty benign, a pretty benign change to our work. Most of our pathway F land use strategies have stayed under ours, just those 4 specific compact settlements have been pulled.
Any questions about that? And we'll get that folded into the draft we post next week.
I
next topic I had was, there was a sustainability definition that Judy suggested, and there was some discussion that sustainability would be, that the definition would be handled somewhere. So Jane, I just wasn't sure where that landed, or where that lands in terms of definitions.
So we're going to talk about this with the steering committee this afternoon. I think that the glossary for the climate action plan is going to be a heavy lift. In one that we're recommending that for the initial cap that gets adopted on the 1st, that we approve the set of terms that will be included in the glossary, and then recommend that we reach consensus with the council after December 1st on the definitions, recognizing that the definitions themselves need to reach agreement by subcommittees and then bring forward to the council. So that's just a recognition and appreciation of time needed to get the glossary and definitions right. And we're going to talk about it this afternoon. So that's my recommendation for the approach, but hasn't been approved by the steering committee or anyone yet.
So Jane, in terms of holding Judy's recommendation or suggestion for the language that we kind of hand it to you to hold and bring up when that whatever group decides to dive into that, is that the place to make sure it lands somewhere?
Sure.
All right, any questions on that? Okay, I want to come back to the climate office. So we had two sets of language, one with, we did some modifications from the work that cross sector had done, and then some that we had done ourselves, and we're kind of running out of time here. So I don't know, Billy and Abby, whether we should turn to Alyssa to try to craft her best effort at putting them together, and we can send around a quick email for a quick comment, and then we fold it into the next draft. How do we want to handle the Office of Climate? Alyssa.
Yeah, I think before we get there, I think it would be helpful to just get a poll from the group on whether or not they would prefer to have kind of pared down short recommendations that don't include all of the nuances of our conversation, or if we really want to cover all of the back and forth.
Right. So what's people's preference for how to, just it gives the writer here some direction about this, the climate office, just you know, kind of talk about the principles of coordination. Yeah, how do you want to do it? You want to do it short and sweet, or craft a little bit longer piece like we did for the land use office?
I'm less
I
concerned
always like including nuance, but
Abby, say that one more time.
sorry, Lauren.
Go ahead.
Oh, I think nuance matters, but if it's not applicable to count here, fine. If it is one of those things that there's multiple viewpoints from different subcommittees, it seems like the nuance would be important to carry with it to understand why we came to the specific type of recommendation that we did.
Lauren, go ahead.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, well, generally I agree with Abby. I'm less concerned with the length of the recommendation, just so much as that the recommendation is clear and that it isn't contradictory, so that somebody who's reading it and who hasn't been part of our very lengthy back and forth on this over the past month and a half understand what the recommendation is asking, even if the nuance is captured, that it's still clear. So I don't want to put forth contradictory language.
So I think Alyssa directions maybe more is more here in this case. And so I'm happy to kind of pull my notes and work with you to support you in trying to craft that, if that's okay. All right, so and I'm also aware too, and I know we still want to leave time for a last public comment. So just next steps. So there's some modest editorial comments from some of the council members that didn't rise to more bigger points that I think each of the pathway authors should consider folding in if they can. That includes a red line strikeout from one or two council members as well, which I can forward to the pathway authors. So my thought is I will try to, if not this afternoon, by tonight, consolidate where we're kind of at with these various pieces, check in with the pathway authors about kind of what you need to do to kind of make changes to your drafts. And I'll send you the response to comments in Google Form because we need to fill that out too, and try to get all that done essentially by close of business Tuesday next week. And then obviously make that all transparent to you, and we can have a final discussion on Friday next. Charlie.
Just wanted to clarify one more time. Do we know when the council is meeting to take this material up? or do we know when we'll know when the council's meeting? It'd be great to be able to block that off in the calendar, but just want to get that as soon as we know.
I can speak to the draft agendas. Right now, the way the agendas are looking, there's just a substantive conversation to go through the cross-cutting pathways, as well as a number of other sections for the CAP that are posted right now for Tuesday of this coming next week. And we plan to take up transportation, which we haven't got spoken about any of the issues or gaps in the transportation sector yet. That's how it's written on the agenda right now. And then Wednesday's meeting, we'll revisit and finish buildings and thermal, as well as non-energy, which we haven't talked about yet either. And then the remaining time on the agenda on Wednesday is broadly for issues and gaps that that counselors want to raise and speak to, but there's not a specific time either one of those agendas to revisit revised documents. But we can point to the fact that they've been posted again on Tuesday for counselors to look at, but they're just be getting them on Tuesday night or Wednesday morning. So I don't think it'll be till the following week that anything will likely be raised, which is the 23rd, the meeting.
Thanks, Jane.
All right. And so I think there is how we kind of manage document flow in that. I will probably need to check in with Jane and Marion at some time today. And I will coordinate with all the authors of each pathway just to be clear about all that. So we move forward in a clear way and keeping you all informed. And I'm aware of two things. One, I also have to jump right at noon or shortly after, but I wanted two things. Judy had a question for Ali about the forest piece. I wanted to get that in. And then I think co-chairs, if Abby can stand a little longer, we could do a final public comment before closing. But Judy and Ali, over to you. Judy, you had a question about the forest to forest.
I did have a question. I appreciate all the really interesting comments that Ali made that she sent us. But my question was not when a tree falls down in a forest, is it still a forest? And not when a microburst comes through and knock down trees, is it still a forest? My question was, when they cut down everything in a forest, is it still counted as a forest? And Ali and I spoke about this, and it is. And so my question is all about when you cut down this old growth forest, it's still considered a forest because there's 6-inch trees there. And how can that possibly be equivalent in carbon until those 6-inch trees are full-grown trees again? I realize it's creating carbon as it's growing, as those 6-inch trees are growing, but it's not really equivalent to a forest. And so is it counted as a forest when it's totally clear cut down and there's 6-inch trees there? And Ali and I spoke on the phone, and I believe I understood what she said was, yes, it's counted as a forest because there's still 6-inch, 2-inch, 3-inch trees.
Ali, I don't know if can you speak to that or others in the forest sector?
Yeah, so I put in the chat the definition of forest land that comes from the U.S. Forest Service. So, I don't know if Judy, I'm not sure if you're talking like Vermont based or I think the question originally came from the carbon budget. So the carbon budget uses U.S. Forest Service data. I didn't really do much analysis for those data. It's just coming from the data that they have compiled for the state of Vermont. So it includes forests that have remained forests, and you can see the definition of what they define as forest land. And then it includes forests that were converted to agriculture or what they call settlement, which is development, or land that had converted from development or agriculture back to forest land. So that's the definition of forest land. You can see it's very technical. That's what they use. And it's on annual time steps. So if a location was cleared for the trees and doesn't meet that definition, it would be considered non-forest. But in subsequent years, it could then be considered forest if it meets that definition. I'm not sure if that helps, Judy. Yeah.
It does.
Okay, great.
Judy, any follow on to that?
No, I just, it just seemed that not proper if you cut down everything and you have 2 and 3 inch trees left to consider that still a forest, because it's going to take 30 years before that's a forest. And to count it as something that is retaining carbon in those first few years of cutting is not right.
Charlie, you had a question or comment, and then I'm going to hand this back, Abby, to you, if that's
I think-
okay.
I think broadly, like, we're taking a pretty nuanced, thing and bringing it down to like a few words, which is always kind of hard or potentially problematic. I think one of the questions that comes up when I hear this discussion is always around scale. And how, when we say forest, how big is a forest? Is it, Winnie the Pooh's 100-acre woods? Is it a 2-acre unit? Is it a 100-foot square gap? I mean, I've seen pictures that have been posted online by groups that say, look at this clear cut, and it's like a 1-acre cut in a much broader context. And I would, so like the thing that I struggle with is the scale we're talking about and how that fits into the bigger picture. And so I think this is a great conversation to have. It's just one that I think that we're not going to be able to solve today, but I would like to have it at some point. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. All right. Abby, I think because of time, I'm going to hand it back to you for final public comment and close, and I will be in touch with the Pathway authors later today or tonight with an email.
Okie dokie. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you.
I think Billy, you said you have to jump too, so I don't want to. So members of the public, if you have comments to add to our thought processes, please raise your Zoom hands. I see Jennifer, and then Zach. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Thanks. I just wanted to echo Judy's concern. And I think one of the things it points to is the intricacies of carbon accounting that we're going to have to come up with, because clearly it's not the same thing, the amount of carbon that's sequestered in an old forest versus one. There is some carbon there, but it's different. And we're just going to have to get better at our ability to account for that, because it shouldn't be assigned the same value as an old forest. And thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. I assume that the intricacies of carbon counting will follow us for many years in the future. Zach, go ahead.
Thanks, Abby. Zach Porter, Standing Trees. Yeah, on that last one, just to pick up where we left off here, I'm really, really grateful that Judy is asking these critical questions. We've been listening for 2 weeks now to world leaders talk about ending deforestation. And what's lost on the general public, and I hope is not lost on you all, is exactly this point that Judy is making, which is that we can make all the pronouncements in the world about deforestation, and it means absolutely nothing here in the US when we are losing carbon at a faster rate, at a larger rate, because of logging, not because forests are being converted into something other than a forest, but because of logging. That's where the greatest carbon losses are happening. So under this really loose definition of what counts as a forest, we end up with a situation where we're really like missing the forest for the trees, right? The big picture here is that logging is kind of going unaccounted for. And that's why it's just critical that we address this. And I'm really, really grateful that Judy is asking these questions. Just because, the USDA says that a forest is an area with 10% tree cover shouldn't mean that that's what Vermont's definition is of a forest. So I would hope that we have a higher standard of what a forest is based on, our own intelligence and our own understanding of our own ecosystem here. Just a few other things here. I am really disturbed by the recommendation that is being proposed right now, creating what I see as a false equivalency between quote unquote working lands, which, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I think that term is just unhelpful. All natural lands are working lands. And when we create this equivalency between working lands and natural lands and say that we don't want, want to avoid net loss between the two, what's going to happen to wetlands, for example, if we continue to lose them due to development, but working lands, on the other hand, perhaps go up in their numbers here in Vermont? That is backsliding on Vermont's current wetlands policies of no net loss, specific to wetlands alone, just to use that one example. So the way this is written, I'm deeply troubled that this is actually going backwards and putting working lands on par with natural lands when what we know is that we have to be elevating those natural lands through this climate action plan process. So I really hope that you will go back and check this language and make sure that we're not somehow going against the current wetlands rules, which should be the starting point for what we do going forward here. I just wanted to also just mention that as far as biomass is concerned, I appreciate that we're making recommendations here that are an improvement on Vermont's current policies towards biomass. But I just wanted to say again that on the record here that biomass produces 1.5 times more carbon than a coal-fired power plant. I can't imagine anybody in the Climate Council suggesting that Vermont would be well served by having a coal-fired power plant in Vermont and then using unproven carbon capture and storage technology to somehow compensate for that. These are all completely false climate solutions, and we should be looking at biomass the same way, not to mention all of the public health issues associated with biomass, the cultural impacts that we've been talking about. So I appreciate that we're heading in the right direction, maybe, but we're not getting to where we need to go nearly quickly enough with the language as it currently stands. We should be getting rid of our dinosaur power plants, McNeil and Reigate. And lastly, on this point about rate hikes, I really think I'm really grateful to you all for staying strong on making sure that we develop renewables in appropriate locations. Suggestions that, ratepayers are going to kind of pay the price for putting renewables in the right location is a joke, honestly. And we should be doing everything that we can to protect ratepayers who need protection from rate hikes. It's a completely kind of false choice to suggest that to put renewables in the right place, we necessarily have to punish the public. And so don't fall for that. And I appreciate you staying strong on that one. So much more to be said, but thank you for your continued good work and vigilance. And I do hope that you will revisit that point about no net loss, conflating no net loss of working lands with natural lands, because that's really a concerning development that seems like it would set a dangerous precedent. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. Cheryl, you want to go?
Hello, hi, thanks. So a few comments, but one very strong request is that you all read that document. And, I keep coming across more and more things, and I know that there are more things out there. I can, get more research and more data for you on biomass and, old growth forest and older trees and et cetera. That really speaks to everything that a lot of the things that you've been talking about here now. One thing I want to talk about also is the responsibility of this subcommittee for figuring out how things are going to be paid, for recommending how things are paid for. I would assume that the Agriculture and Ecosystems Subcommittee is a committee that is to give recommendations on the best practices to move forward with regard to climate, answering the climate change question for our ecosystems and agriculture. Not how we're going to pay for it, not how we're going to make sure that Green Mountain Power keeps making money, how we're going to make sure that Reigate and the other one, sorry guys, is going to continue to make money. We're working on how to solve the climate issue, not how to make sure entities continue to make money. And we should recommend perhaps that the changes move forward in an equitable fashion, because as many people have said, the ratepayers should not be responsible, because that's without justice and without equity. As for what is a forest, it's silly for me to start naming things off. There are many different types of forests, many different meanings of forest, and many different ecosystem services and inherent services and realities of what different forests are. And what we have here in Vermont with houses or residences every 10 acres, this is a different kind of a forest and serves different kind of species than one that is 300 acres that's untouched. And we all know that. So I'm not even going to go there, and y'all can read what I've written and also just talk to each other, because there are people here on this panel or subcommittee that have that answer. And when you cut down tree, then the little sapling that you are putting in place of that 3-foot diameter DBH tree that you cut down, that sapling won't have the sequestration and storage that the tree that you cut down did for I don't know, depends on the species, but 80 years, 100 years, 150 years. So that's, I'll stop talking about forests. You all know what I'm talking about, and please read the document and read all of the links in it. And additionally, with regard to solar siting and wind siting, we can use the land that we've already impacted and not use any quote natural or working lands for that. I can understand the people who really want to working it together with their agriculture, like the solar panels and sheep, etc. But I don't think that actually should be a thing, because that land ought to be, if it's not ag, go back to forest and natural lands. But there are other things. There's new technology that I don't hear people talking about, the roof shingles and roadways that are solar, have solar collectors in them, and some other technology that I'm sure I'm not aware of yet. And I also was going to bring up, but saw that other people had, covering all the parking lots. In development, then whenever any new construction should be sited so that it would be accessible to either wind or solar, and on, and there are that kind of thing. But please read the document, and please share with people who leave this information, because the public comment section, Billy hasn't heard what I've said, or Zach, or Jennifer, or Annette, or whoever else has spoken. And there are others that are missing it as well when we have these public comments after the meetings are over. So that was actually a question for you all. Is the subcommittee responsible for figuring out the financial, the funding of all these recommendations?
Jane will have to help me with this. There is some language in the law that indicates that's what the tables are in our recommendations around impact, equity, cost effectiveness, and technical feasibility. Those were the criteria that were laid out in the law that we were supposed to be filtering our recommendations through. The timeline has certainly impacted our ability to do particularly the funding components of this work to my knowledge, to any real extent. I think the thing that I want to respond to is, yes, we are tasked to put forward the best recommendations that we can to the Climate Council, but it's within the tenets that the law set forth, and cost effectiveness is one of those components that we are supposed to consider to the best of our ability, as I understand it. Jane, I'm happy to let you correct where I went awry on that. But that's my understanding, and I think that's the balance that we're trying to hit. And again, yes, Judy, time. you know, again, I will say, this subcommittee is almost at the end of its relevance in a way at this moment. I mean, it's the arguments you're making, the education you're trying to provide, et cetera, is going, you know, the full council makes the ultimate decision, I guess, is what I just will continue to say. And then after that, we have no idea what the legislature will do with this. And so, you know, it might be that you'll want to track this as it moves through the legislature this session, to be able to make sure that some of those components you're introducing are covered. If there's nothing else, then I guess we'll call it. Appreciation for everybody who stayed on the line. Appreciation to the members of the public for the fact that we went over. I know time continues to be an issue. I do apologize that continues to fall on you guys, and appreciate the fact that you stay and share with us your thinking after we've gone through everything. So appreciation to everybody for sticking with us, and I hope that everybody has a restful weekend.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.